The fete in Marleycombite was one of those soft, radiant June afternoons in Marleycombe, when the English countryside seemed almost indecently content with itself. The sky was a broad sweep of luminous blue, patched here and there with idle, drifting clouds. Roses sprawled over trellises in heavy, fragrant clumps, and the village green, freshly mown, still bearing the neat stripes of the mower's passage, was dotted with stalls and fluttering bunting. The annual Marleycombe summer fete was in full swing. There was a modest brass band under a white awning, valiantly turning out waltzes and cheerful marches. Stalls of homemade jams and honey, children running races in squealing groups, their mothers clapping encouragement. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, presided over the tea tent with a kind of benevolent tyranny, marshalling her helpers with brisk nods. Beside her, plates piled high with seed cake and buttered scones threatened to slide off the edge of the long table's dot. Miss Marple, small, neat, and delicately pink in the face from the sun, was seated with her friend Mrs. Digby on a pair of wobbly wooden chairs just outside the tent. She sipped her tea carefully, observing the bustle with a pleased, tranquil eye. "It's been such a perfect day," said Mrs. Digby, fanning herself with her hat. "No unexpected showers, no dreadful wind. And look at that turnout. Quite half the village here." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, my dear, there's something so reassuring about a fete. One sees the whole pattern of the community laid out, just as clearly as the flower beds in your garden." Mrs. Digby gave a tolerant chuckle. "Trust you to look at it that way, Jane. For me, it's simply a chance to eat more seed cake than I should." Not far off, Colonel Foster was having a loud, jolly argument with Mr. Digby over the weight of the prize marrow. Young George Harris and his sister, all freckles and excitement, were chasing each other around the coconut shy. Near the bandstand, Mr. Lionel Rake, newly arrived in the village these past 6 months, renting rooms from old Mrs. Pettigrew, was deep in conversation with Mrs. Trevelyan, a pretty woman in her early 30s, who looked rather too elegant for country tastes, in a dress of pale green that seemed chosen to catch the light dot Miss Marple's eyes rested on them a moment longer than necessary. Lionel Rake was a man she had noticed before, handsome in a somewhat oily way, with curling dark hair and the habit of laughing just a shade too heartily. It was curious, she thought, how he always managed to be in the company of whichever lady looked most flattered by attention. Mrs. Digby leaned closer. "Between ourselves, Jane, I don't care for that Mr. Rake. Too smooth by half. And I hear he's been borrowing money from the most unexpected people, even from Mr. Digby, who is far too soft-hearted." Miss Marple merely inclined her head. "I have found, over long years, that when there is too much charm, there is very often something lacking underneath. But it is only an observation. Of course." At that very moment, a sudden shriek tore through the pleasant din of the fete. It was a woman's voice, sharp, panicked, horribly out of place amid the laughter and music. The band stumbled to a halt on a sour note. Heads turned. Young maid, hardly more than a girl, was running toward the tea tent, her white apron fluttering. Her eyes were wide with terror. "Oh, Mrs. Oh, Mrs." She gasped, clutching at Mrs. Clement's arm. "There's a gentleman behind the hedge by the vicarage. I think, oh Lord, he's dead. He must be dead." A chill seemed to ripple through the gathering. Mrs. Clement dropped her teapot. It landed on the grass with a dull thump, spilling brown liquid over her shoes. Several people began talking all at once. Colonel Foster strode over at once, his sun-reddened face drawn into a scowl. "Now then, what's all this? Dead, you say? Where exactly?" Miss Marple set down her cup with hands that were perfectly steady. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Perhaps we should see if any help can be given," she murmured. Mrs. Digby clutched her arm, pale and trembling. Together with a small knot of curious villagers, they made their way across the green to the neat privet hedge that bordered the vicarage lawn. There, in a shaded hollow where the grass grew uneven and tufts of nettles tangled up against the stones, lay the unmistakable form of Lionel Rake. He was sprawled on his back, one arm flung awkwardly above his head, the other clutching at his chest. His eyes were open, staring at the drifting sky with an expression of almost comic surprise. The front of his waistcoat was horribly stained with dark, drying blood. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Trevelyan, who had come running behind them, gave a strangled little cry and turned away, covering her mouth with a gloved hand. Colonel Foster cleared his throat, sounding uncharacteristically uncertain. "Better send for Dr. Moore. And the police, of course, though it looks plain enough to me." Miss Marple did not contradict him. She simply gazed down at Lionel Rake with that gentle, thoughtful expression she wore when considering an especially intricate bit of lacework. Her eyes moved slowly over the grass, the hedge, the drooping hand with its ink-smudged fingertips. There was something, a crumpled scrap of white, caught just under the edge of his coat. Without quite realizing she was doing it, Miss Marple bent down and carefully retrieved it. It was a torn piece of fine linen, stained with a blot of blue-black ink. She folded it into her handkerchief and tucked it into her pocket before anyone noticed. "Poor man," murmured Mrs. Digby faintly. "Who would do such a thing, Jane?" "Miss." Marple squeezed her friend's arm. "That, my dear, is precisely what we must discover." Above them, the band began a slow, uncertain tune, as though trying to fill the awful silence that had fallen over the fete. In the distance, children's laughter still floated on the air, but it seemed now a terrible sort of mockery. Whisperings and tea leaves, the shock of Lionel Rake's death settled over Marley Combe like an unexpected frost. Within hours, the peaceful summer fete, once so bright with bunting and laughter, seemed only a half-remembered dream. Green was empty now, littered with torn programs and crushed paper cups, as though a careless hand had swept the village's gaiety aside by evening. The police had come from Brandleford, the nearest market town. Inspector Calloway, a broad man with small, watchful eyes and a ginger mustache, arrived with 2 uniformed constables and took immediate command of the vicarage lawn. The villagers gathered at respectful distances, pretending to busy themselves with errands that kept them conveniently close. Even so, the curious nature of small communities asserted itself. Whispers flew from house to house faster than the inspector's notes could be taken. Miss Marple spent that evening at the Digby's cottage, sipping chamomile tea with Mrs. Digby by the hearth. Outside the sitting-room window, twilight was sinking into a smoky violet, and the warm lamplight carved soft golden shapes against the walls. "It's a dreadful business," Mrs. Digby sighed, stirring her tea for far too long, without lifting it to her lips. "I keep thinking of poor Mrs. Pettigrew. Imagine having a murder victim under one's roof, even if only as a lodger." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and she's a timid creature, though I dare say she will find comfort in telling the tale. People do, you know. It's rather shocking how grief and fright so often turn into a kind of relish for detail." Mrs. Digby looked scandalized. "Jane!" "Oh, not maliciously," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "It is only human nature. We all want to make sense of things, so we dwell on them, retell them, tidy them up, even when they are horrible." A little later, Dr. Moore arrived, his shoulders dusted with late dew, to report on the official findings. As village doctor, he seemed half medical man, half confessor. He accepted a slice of seed cake, but hardly touched it. "It's quite certain he was stabbed clean through the heart," he said heavily. "Death must have been instant. Whoever did it came at him directly. There was no sign of struggle beyond. A few broken twigs, Odd thing, there were fresh ink stains on his fingers and a little smudge near the wound, though I cannot see the relevance. I suppose the police will figure it out. Miss Marple's blue eyes brightened almost imperceptibly, though she made no comment. She merely sat back, her hands folded over her neat gray dress, and let the others speculate. Gossip takes root by the following morning. Marleycombe was alive with theories. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Bowyer confided breathlessly to Mrs. Trent that it must have been a crime of passion. She had seen Lionel Rake walking with Mrs. Trevelyan more than once, and there was a look in her eyes, mark my words. Meanwhile, at the post office, Mr. Hargreaves insisted to a nodding line of customers that Rake was ruined by gambling debts and likely threatened someone too dangerous to cross-dot Miss Marple, making her slow, measured way between errands, heard each fragment and tucked it away without comment. She bought a half-dozen eggs, discussed the damp weather likely to blight Mr. Digby's dahlias, and paid special attention when Mrs. Clement's maid, the same girl who had found the body, passed by looking pale and pinched. "Dear child, I do hope you're feeling steadier today," Miss Marple said gently, laying a hand on her arm. "It must have been such a shock." The girl swallowed. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. I keep seeing him, lying there with his eyes all empty. Inspector says they'll want me to come give a statement again tomorrow. And you shall do very well. Just tell exactly what you saw, no more and no less. That is always safest." The girl gave her a watery smile, and Miss Marple watched her hurry away down an official theory that afternoon. Inspector Calloway called at Miss Marple's cottage on Church Lane, removing his hat with stiff politeness. His face bore a look of cautious satisfaction. "I thought it only proper to inform you, Miss Marple, since I'm told you knew the deceased and have such close ties in the village. We've made considerable progress already. It appears Mr. Rake was pressing certain parties for money. We found a torn note in his coat pocket. Looked very much like a threat of exposure. That gives us a motive, don't you see?" "Exposure of what, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked mildly, pouring out tea with her usual delicate precision. "Hard to say at present. But we've reason to believe young Mr. Trevelyan may be involved. Yes, quite regrettable. Rake had apparently hinted he might reveal something damaging to the family name if his loans were not forthcoming." Miss Marple looked faintly sad. "And so you believe Mr. Trevelyan killed him to preserve his good name?" "It fits neatly enough. The young man's boots had fresh grass stains and a smear of ink on the cuff, possibly from a note or a letter he snatched back in the struggle. We'll have a clearer picture once the forensics chaps from Brambleford finish with the handwriting. Samples." Miss Marple's quiet doubts long after the inspector had departed. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap. Outside, the bees were still busy among the hollyhocks. Her mind, however, was not on flowers or even on stitches. She thought, instead of how young Mr. Trevelyan had looked that morning on the lane, pale and dazed, yes, but not guilty. She thought of Mrs. Trevelyan, her face strained as she tried to keep up appearances, and of Mrs. Pettigrew wringing her hands over lost rent. And most of all, she thought of that ink-stained scrap of linen still tucked in her small locked drawer. Human nature, she reflected, was very like her old tea leaves, a muddle at first glance, swirling in unexpected currents. Only patience and a discerning eye brought out the true shapes hidden within, and so she resolved to call the next day upon Mrs. Pettigrew, quite innocently, quite socially. Perhaps under the gentle pressure of Miss Marple's kindly interest, something might emerge that would not have dared to rise under Inspector Calloway's brisk official questions. Because, she thought, gently but firmly setting aside her knitting, it was quite clear to her that whoever had killed Lionel Rake, it was not young Mr. Trevelyan. The inspector calls again. The afternoon wore on with the steady, unhurried pace of village life. Children's laughter echoed from the green, mingling with the faint clink of teacups and the drone of bees in sun-warmed flowers. Yet beneath this charming surface, the air of Marleycombe was undeniably altered, taut with speculation and fear. Miss Marple had just settled down with a small pile of mending by her parlor window when there came a brisk rap at the door. Her maid, Edna, admitted. Inspector Graves, who stepped in with his hat under his arm and a slightly apologetic air. Miss Marple, forgive me dropping by unannounced. My dear Inspector, you are always welcome, she assured him, laying aside her sewing. I trust you will allow me to offer you a cup of tea? Very kind, but I mustn't stay long. Just a few routine inquiries, you understand. Quiet. Probing, he took the armchair across from her, producing a small notebook and pencil. Miss Marple watched with mild, attentive eyes. You have lived here many years, Miss Marple, Graves began. You know the people as few others do. I wonder. If you can tell me, did Mr. Rake seem to you a man under strain lately, or perhaps involved in any disputes? Miss Marple reflected. I believe he was rather proud of putting people on edge, a talent for discovering private matters and letting it be known he was aware of them. That alone could make enemies. As for any single quarrel of serious note, I cannot say I observed. Graves made a small humming sound and wrote something down. What about this fellow Dupper, the artist? You'd not heard of any trouble between them? Only idle village whispers. Someone mentioned seeing them in earnest conversation that did not look altogether friendly. But you know how easily one misjudges a passing scene. Yes, indeed. It is curious, though. Mr. Dupper claimed to be painting by the river for nearly the whole afternoon before the fete, yet nobody seems to have noticed him there at that hour. An alibi nobody can confirm? Miss Marple asked delicately. The inspector tapped his pencil against his notebook. Just so. Tell me, have you seen much of young Mrs. Trevelyan these last days? Only a little. The poor child is very distressed and quite fearful of gossip. Graves sighed, leaning back. There's rather more than gossip, I fear. Rake was carrying an envelope with the Trevelyan's crest on it when we found him. Empty, of course. Looks as though it may have contained a check. Indeed? How very unfortunate. A stray question. The inspector paused, scrutinizing her face. You take it calmly, Miss Marple. Most ladies would be shocked. Miss Marple gave a soft, fleeting smile. You must remember, Inspector, that I have observed human nature for many long years. I have found that it is never entirely surprising when someone is driven to desperate measures, though that does not mean they are necessarily guilty of murder. Graves gave a short laugh. Very wisely said. I suppose that is why I rely on your impressions. Between ourselves, I am not convinced we have found the real shape of this matter yet. Too many small points that will not fall into place, such as... Graves hesitated, then decided to trust her. There were faint stains on the inside of Mr. Rake's right glove. Ink, most likely. But why put on gloves after blotting his hands, or perhaps after writing something, instead of before? And why were the gloves stuffed hastily into his jacket pocket, rather than worn properly or discarded altogether? It is these small puzzles that trouble me. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, they would trouble me as well. The gardener's tale. Just then Edna appeared again, bobbing a curtsy. Beg pardon, ma'am. Mr. Jessop's in the hall. Says he has your garden accounts, but he looks a bit put out. Shall I show him in? By all means. In came Mr. Jessop, the sturdy village gardener, with his heavy boots and cap in hand. His weathered face bore lines of worry. Sorry to disturb you, Miss Marple, but I thought you'd best know. I saw something odd down by the lane as I was trimming the yew hedges. That painter fellow, Mr. Dupper, he was fussing round the Trevelyan. hedge with a handkerchief. Looked for all the world like he was trying to wipe something off the gatepost. When he saw me watching, he near jumped out of his skin and hurried off. Inspector Graves straightened. When was this? This morning, sir. About 10:30. Graves jotted it down. Very interesting. We'll have another talk with Mr. Dupper, I think. Jessup touched his cap again. Didn't mean to cause any stir, but seemed queer to me. You did quite right, Miss Marple assured him warmly. In a village, one must notice such small peculiarities. Often they prove most enlightening. A thoughtful silence when Jessup had gone. The inspector rose too. Thank you, Miss Marple. As always, you have been more help than you know. After he left, Miss Marple sat very still in her quiet parlor, the ticking of the clock sounding louder than before. Her knitting lay untouched in her lapdot. It was becoming ever clearer that someone in Marleycombe had spun a careful tangle of deceit, yet already little threads were beginning to show through, like the worn places in an old carpet. And when enough threads loosened, the whole pattern might be revealed. She gazed out at her roses, nodding gently in the sun, and thought of ink-stained gloves and men who feared being observed. Sooner or later, she promised herself with a small, almost mischievous smile, the truth would come out. An invitation to tea the following morning broke fair and bright, as though the sun itself had resolved to mock the undercurrents of dread that ran through Marleycombe. Birds chattered in hedgerows. The village green shone dew-laced and tranquil, but the hearts of its residents were far from easy. The murder of Giles Rake lingered like a shadow, and with Inspector Graves' inquiries growing sharper, even the most innocent felt an uncomfortable need to examine their consciences. Miss Marple, for her part, rose early, attended to her modest household matters, and then wrote out 2 brief notes in her small, neat hand. One she addressed to Mrs. Emily Trevelyan at the Manor House, and the other to Mr. Victor Dupper, care of his lodgings above Mrs. Granger's milliner's shop. She instructed Edna to have young Peter deliver them straight away. Then she settled herself with her needlework and waited. A nervous visitor, it was Mrs. Trevelyan, who arrived first, escorted into the sunny parlor by Edna. The young woman looked drawn and pale beneath her fashionable hat, and her gloved hands twitched at the clasp of her handbag. My dear Mrs. Trevelyan, how good of you to come, Miss Marple said kindly, indicating the chair by the window. I know what a strain these days have been for you. Oh, Miss Marple, it is dreadful. Emily burst out, her voice cracking. The servants whisper, people stare, and Inspector Graves called again yesterday evening. George scarcely speaks at all. I feel I am living in a dream that could turn to nightmare at any moment. I quite understand. That is why I thought perhaps a quiet chat might do you good. A cup of tea is often the best of restoratives. She poured with calm efficiency, adding a small plate of shortbread within easy reach. Emily tried to smile, but her eyes brimmed. Subtle questions Miss Marple chose her topics with delicate skill. They began by discussing the village fete, arrangements for next Sunday's choir practice, and whether the new vicar's sermon had been overly long. Only gradually did she allow the conversation to drift nearer the subject of Giles Rake. He was so indiscreet, was he not? Miss Marple remarked gently. I have known him speak with unnecessary relish of matters that would pain a lady's heart. Did he ever so trouble you, my dear? Emily's cup rattled against its saucer. I scarcely knew him well. George always handled any of our accounts with Mr. Rake directly. Yes, of course. And yet one hears he was seen walking with you on the edge of the copse last Thursday evening. A flush rose on Emily's delicate throat. It was nothing. He accosted me quite suddenly, spoke of a small matter of parish donations. I thought it impertinent, but, oh, Miss Marple, please believe I had no secret dealings with him. Miss Marple patted her hand. My dear child, I believe nothing unkind of you. But you must see why appearances worry Inspector Graves. It is best to be quite open, so he may be sure of your innocence." Emily's tears spilled over then. She dabbed at them, confessing in a rush. "I fear Giles Rake was about to suggest something vile, to imply he knew of little extravagances I had kept from George. Tiny debts at the dressmaker's, nothing wicked, but enough that George might be angry. Rake hinted he might speak to him unless I was willing to be more amiable to his attentions. I see. That was very wrong of him. And you refused, of course." "Of course." "I left him standing there and hurried home. I told George only that Rake was fussing about money for the flower show. I was ashamed. Now I fear it looks as though I had something dreadful to hide." Miss Marple squeezed her hand. "Take heart, my dear. Truth has a way of emerging, and you have told me frankly. That counts for much." An artist's unease hardly had Emily departed when the doorbell rang again. This time it was Victor Dupper, who entered with his long limbs and restless eyes. He held his hat crushed between his hands, and though he tried to smile, the effect was strained. "You wish to see me, Miss Marple?" he asked, after bowing awkwardly. "Yes, Mr. Dupper. Do. Sit down. It has struck me that with all this turmoil, no one has asked how you are bearing up. Marleycombe can be an unkind place when suspicion starts its work." His laugh was brittle. "Indeed, I am quite aware that several respectable persons cross the street rather than greet me. I suppose your Inspector Graves has given them ideas." Miss Marple poured in tea. "Perhaps. Yet I fancy you have not made it easier for yourself. Why, for instance, were you seen wiping something from the Trevilian gatepost yesterday morning?" Dupper stared at her, mouth falling open. "That old gardener, he told you? It was hardly sinister. A smear of oil paint from my sleeve, I imagine, brushed as I leaned there the day before. I feared it might be thought vandalism. So I panicked." "It seems a small thing to panic over," Miss Marple remarked mildly. He flushed. "Perhaps I am more sensitive than most. Being a foreigner, a mere artist in the eyes of your villagers, it does not take much to brand one suspect." Miss Marple's expression was gentle but searching. "And yet it is odd, Mr. Dupper, that you were nowhere near your beloved river on the afternoon of the fete. You paint such lovely studies there. Surely you would not forego that light?" His gaze dropped. I had a headache. I went instead to lie in my rooms. Mrs. Granger can tell you she brought me a tisane." "Indeed? I shall remember that. I do hope your head troubles you no longer." Dupper rose abruptly. "No, madam, it does not. I thank you for your concern." He left with stiff courtesy, his back rigid. Miss Marple watched the door close. Her face thoughtful. The net begins to tighten as the day waned into golden evening. Miss Marple sat alone once more, her knitting in her lap untouched. Outside, the shadows lengthened across the lane, and swallows dipped and soared in a graceful ballet. She thought of Mrs. Trevilian's frightened confession, of Victor Dupper's evasions, and of the curious case of the ink-stained gloves which seemed to hide more than mere stained fingers. Already, in the recesses of her sharp, kindly mind, a fragile outline of the truth was beginning to form, but it was not yet complete. There remained pieces to place, old resentments to unearth, small, careless words to reconsider. And she would do so with the patient care of one tending a delicate rosebush, until the tangled knots gave way and the heart of the mystery stood clear. Whispers and a broken teacup by the next morning, Marleycombe seemed to have settled into a deceptive calm. The village shops opened as usual. Carts rattled along the lanes with fresh milk and bread. But beneath the surface, gossip was a living thing, darting, coiling, striking when least expected. Miss Marple observed it all from her garden bench, where she sat with a small basket of mending. The scent of lavender and thyme floated about her, but her eyes were distant. She watched, as Mrs. Withers bustled out of the bakery, stopping to whisper furiously into Mrs. Drayton's ear. The two women clucked like agitated hens, their glances darting toward the Trevilian's house dot. Then young Timothy Cresswell sped past on his bicycle, nearly colliding with the postman, who was shaking his head over the very latest tidbit. That Inspector Graves had spent nearly 2 hours at the manor that morning, Dot, and all the while the villagers carefully avoided mentioning Miss Marple's own role in things, though they eyed her neat gait with mixed relief and suspicion. For they all knew, in that wordless way small communities do, that if there were secrets still to be unearthed, it would be dear, dangerous Miss Marple who found them out. A painful conversation after luncheon, Miss Marple decided to pay. A call on Dr. Hayworth. She found the good doctor in his study, frowning over a sheaf of notes. His spectacles were perched low on his nose, and he seemed both surprised and faintly alarmed to see her on his doorstep. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, ushering her in with a nervous flourish, "pray forgive the confusion. I've been trying to make sense of Inspector Graves' latest questions. This case, it is altogether outside my comfort." Miss Marple accepted a seat by the window. "I won't keep you long. It is only that, well, I feel something isn't quite right in this business, and thought perhaps your observations might guide me." Dr. Hayworth sighed, removing his glasses to polish them. "To be frank, I suspect half the village could claim headaches and sleeplessness since poor Rake's murder. Even so, it is curious how many seem truly overwrought. Emily Trevilian has grown positively wan, and her husband shows signs of deep strain. As for Victor Dupper, he came to me only yesterday for a sleeping draught." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "He is a sensitive young man. He is that, but there are limits to nervous delicacy. I could not help noting how his hands shook when I handed him the vial, and his pulse was most erratic, almost, dare I say it, like a man wrestling with a very guilty conscience." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you, Doctor. That is most helpful." A violent slip as she made her way home along the quiet lane. Miss Marple was accosted by Mrs. Ellison, the vicar's sister, who was returning from a parish meeting. Mrs. Ellison was a thin, high-strung woman, known for her quick temper and quicker tongue. She looked flushed and distracted, and held her reticule as if it might bite her. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "I was coming directly to see you. Such dreadful news. Inspector Graves has found a small scrap of cloth behind the summer-house. Blood on it, he says. Imagine that. He's taken it away for analysis." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "Indeed, that will stir the village afresh. Did you hear how he came by it? They say Mrs. Granger's youngest boy found it while chasing his dog. I dare say it will all end in some perfectly harmless explanation. But until then, oh, people will talk. I must hurry. Mrs. Withers is expecting me for tea." She darted off, leaving Miss Marple with the strong sense that Mrs. Ellison was eager to be anywhere other than under her calm gaze. A sharp ear at the gate. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Miss Marple reached her own gate, just in time to overhear an argument in the lane beyond her privet hedge. She paused discreetly. Hidden from view, Dot, it was George Trevilian's voice, low but fierce. "Telling you again, keep away from my wife. I don't care what you claim, you know. If you dare breathe another word," then Dupper's sharper, accented tones. "You mistake me, sir. I only wish to assure Mrs. Trevilian that my painting of her was destroyed. There is no cause for your brutish threats." A tense silence, then George's voice, hoarse and tight. "If I so much as see you near her again, Dupper, I'll do more than threaten. Do you understand?" Footsteps crunched on the gravel. then faded. Miss Marple allowed several moments to pass before she stepped out, as if just returning from the opposite direction. Dupper gave her a startled, hunted look before hurrying away. A broken teacup that evening brought another visitor. Edna answered the door and returned looking pale. "It's Mrs. Ellison, madam. She says it's urgent." Miss Marple found the vicar's sister in her parlor, twisting her gloves and near tears. "Miss Marple, I don't know where else to turn. I fear I have done something terribly foolish. Please sit down and tell me quietly." With halting words, Mrs. Ellison confessed that she had once borrowed a small sum from Giles Rake, only £15, to pay a pressing account at the dressmaker's. My brother would have been so scandalized. Giles was very obliging then, but last week he began hinting that I might persuade the vicar to back a certain building scheme of his. When I refused, he became quite horrid, said he might expose my debts. Miss Marple patted her hand. "I see. And this worried you so that the very evening he died, I went out after dinner and tried to confront him. I meant to beg him not to ruin my brother's reputation. But when I reached the path by the river, he was not there. I must have looked a fool, creeping about with my lantern. And now, with that bloody scrap found, oh, Miss Marple, what if someone saw me?" She trembled so violently that her teacup slipped from her hands and shattered on the hearth. Miss Marple rang for Edna, who came with broom and dustpan. Through it all, she spoke soothingly, promising that Mrs. Ellison's fears need not become more than they were, fears. But once the poor woman had gone, Miss Marple sat long in thought, fingers steepled, her knitting basket quite forgotten. The threads of the case were tightening, pulling more villagers into their weave. Secrets lay everywhere, tangled beneath the polite surface of tea and hymnals. And somewhere among these trembling hearts was the one that had truly reason to fear discovery. She meant to find it before Inspector Graves made an arrest that would satisfy only the village's appetite for scandal, not the demands of justice. The garden party that wasn't Saturday dawned bright and deceptively cheerful, the sort of summer day Marleycombe prided itself upon. By 10 o'clock, the village square was alive with preparations for Mrs. Drayton's annual garden party. A tradition said to bring the whole parish together under the sun, God willing, as she liked to say. But by noon, a subtle change had settled over the gathering. The bunting still fluttered, the tea urns still steamed, but people's laughter held an edge, and glances darted more nervously than usual. For Inspector Graves had chosen precisely this day to make fresh inquiries, and Miss Marple, with her gentle, almost absent-minded air, moved through the crowd like a quiet current, feeling every swirl of tension. That appointed absence Emily Trevelyan arrived alone, her gown a soft lavender that made her appear delicate and haunted. People whispered. Where was her husband? George's notable absence was remarked upon by nearly every tongue, though few dared ask outright. Victor Dupper stood under the shade of a copper beech, sketchbook conspicuously absent. His hands roamed through his hair as he spoke with Mrs. Granger, who eyed him as if she might slip away at the slightest excuse. When he noticed Miss Marple watching, he gave a stiff bow and quickly turned aside. Even young Timothy Cresswell, so often seen joking with the maids, seemed subdued. He hovered near the lemonade table, speaking in low tones to his sister Clara, who kept darting looks at the inspector, striding heavily from knot to knot of villagers. Inspector Graves stirs the pot. Miss Marple was sipping a mild cup of elderflower, cordial when Inspector Graves approached her, mustache bristling. His boots left faint marks on the grass, which Mrs. Drayton would later lament. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, voice loaded with officious politeness. "May I trouble you for a word? Though no doubt your good sense has already been at work on this unfortunate business." Miss Marple set down her glass. I fear my observations are only of human foibles, Inspector. Nothing concrete. Graves's eyes narrowed. Foibles often point the way to more serious sins, ma'am. I've seen many a seemingly innocent lady show her true colors when pressed. Take Mrs. Ellison, for instance. Did you know she was in debt to the deceased? Small sums, perhaps, but a hold nonetheless. Miss Marple's hands lay calmly folded. I was aware Mrs. Ellison sometimes finds her position delicate, but surely that is not so uncommon? Many gentlewomen must juggle their bills more artfully than they like. Graves gave a mirthless smile. Perhaps. Yet debts can breed desperation, as can jealousy or the fear of disgrace. I assure you, Miss Marple, I mean to see this case through without being distracted by local sentiment. And I have no doubt of it, Miss Marple replied gently. But sometimes sentiment is precisely what uncovers truth, the way it coils around our hearts, making us act out of character. You might consider that. Graves tipped his hat, faintly irritated, and moved on to interrogate young Clara Cresswell, who blushed to the roots of her hair. A sudden disturbance, it was just past 3 when the calm cracked. A shriek burst from near the rose arch, followed by the crash of a tipped tray. People spun to see Emily Trevelyan collapsed on the lawn, her hands clutching her throat. Miss Marple was among the first to reach her. Emily's eyes were wide and terrified. He threatened me, she gasped. George said if I ever spoke. She broke off in sobs. Mrs. Drayton knelt beside her, pressing a lavender-scented handkerchief to her brow. What on earth does she mean by this? Mrs. Drayton whispered fiercely to Miss Marple. Surely not her own husband? The poor woman's overwrought. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind ticked rapidly. Nearby, Inspector Graves's face lit with the dark satisfaction of a man who senses his quarry is near. He strode off, already calling for one of his constables. A curious conversation later, while the party was dissolving under embarrassed murmurs and hasty farewells. Miss Marple encountered Victor Dupper lingering at the edge of the orchard. His face was pale beneath its usual warm tan, and he startled when she greeted him. "Ah, Madame Marple," he said, twisting his hat between his long fingers. I confess I am almost relieved to see you. So many here look at me as though I were already condemned. Perhaps they are simply unsettled. A murder does that to people. Perhaps." He hesitated. "I wonder, did you know that Giles Rake offered to buy one of my canvases only last month? Insisted, really. Then, when I refused, he threatened to spread tales about me and Madame Trevelyan. Foul lies. Emily was only ever kind, never improper. I swear this on my mother's grave." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You refused to sell the painting. Was it by chance a portrait of Mrs. Trevelyan?" Dupper's shoulders slumped. "We? Madame, I thought it was not finished, and might bring embarrassment. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I should have let him have it. And none of this," he broke off, swallowing hard. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. "No, Mr. Dupper, one must never let oneself be blackmailed, in art or anything else. It only invites worse." He nodded mutely, eyes bright, then turned and walked away into the twilight. The calm before something breaks that evening found Miss Marple on her porch with her knitting. The roses were heavy on their stems, nodding in the dusk. Inside, Edna moved quietly about with a tray. A carriage rattled past, carrying Inspector Graves toward the Trevelyans' manor. Miss Marple watched it go with a faint sigh. The net was tightening, but she feared it might close around the wrong creature, driven by petty scandals and human cowardice, rather than true understanding. She bent again to her needles, yet her mind was far from the simple pattern of yarn. Soon she knew something else must break open. A secret, a conscience, perhaps even another fragile life, and she meant to be ready when it did. The garden party that wasn't Saturday dawned bright and deceptively cheerful, the sort of summer day Marleycombe prided itself upon. By 10 o'clock, the village square was alive with preparations for Mrs. Drayton's annual garden party. A tradition said to bring the whole parish together under the sun, God willing, as she liked to say. But by noon, a subtle change had settled over the gathering. The bunting still fluttered, the tea urns still steamed, but people's laughter held an edge, and glances darted more nervously than usual. For Inspector Graves had chosen precisely this day to make fresh inquiries, and Miss Marple, with her gentle, almost absent-minded air, moved through the crowd like a quiet current, feeling every swirl of tension. That appointed absence Emily Trevelyan arrived alone, her gown a soft lavender that made her appear delicate and haunted. People whispered. Where was her husband? George's notable absence was remarked upon by nearly every tongue, though few dared ask outright. Victor Dupper stood under the shade of a copper beech, sketchbook conspicuously absent. His hands roamed through his hair as he spoke with Mrs. Granger, who eyed him as if she might slip away at the slightest excuse. When he noticed Miss Marple watching, he gave a stiff bow and quickly turned aside. Even young Timothy Cresswell, so often seen joking with the maids, seemed subdued. He hovered near the lemonade table, speaking in low tones to his sister Clara, who kept darting looks at the inspector, striding heavily from knot to knot of villagers. Inspector Graves stirs the pot. Miss Marple was sipping a mild cup of elderflower, cordial when Inspector Graves approached her, mustache bristling. His boots left faint marks on the grass, which Mrs. Drayton would later lament. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, voice loaded with officious politeness. "May I trouble you for a word? Though no doubt your good sense has already been at work on this unfortunate business." Miss Marple set down her glass. "I fear my observations are only of human foibles, Inspector. Nothing concrete." Graves's eyes narrowed. "Foibles often point the way to more serious sins, ma'am. I've seen many a seemingly innocent lady show her true colors when pressed. Take Mrs. Ellison, for instance. Did you know she was in debt to the deceased? Small sums, perhaps, but a hold none the less." Miss Marple's hands lay calmly folded. "I was aware Mrs. Ellison sometimes finds her position delicate, but surely that is not so uncommon? Many gentlewomen must juggle their bills more artfully than they like." Graves gave a mirthless smile. "Perhaps. Yet debts can breed desperation, as can jealousy or the fear of disgrace. I assure you, Miss Marple, I mean to see this case through without being distracted by local sentiment." "And I have no doubt of it," Miss Marple replied gently. "But sometimes sentiment is precisely what uncovers truth, the way it coils around our hearts, making us act out of character. You might consider that." Graves tipped his hat, faintly irritated, and moved on to interrogate young Clara Cresswell, who blushed to the roots of her hair. A sudden disturbance. It was just past 3 when the calm cracked. A shriek burst from near the rose arch, followed by the crash of a tipped tray. People spun to see Emily Trevelyan collapsed on the lawn, her hands clutching her throat. Miss Marple was among the first to reach her. Emily's eyes were wide and terrified. He threatened me," she gasped. "George said if I ever spoke," she broke off in sobs. Mrs. Drayton knelt beside her, pressing a lavender-scented handkerchief to her brow. "What on earth does she mean by this?" Mrs. Drayton whispered fiercely to Miss Marple. "Surely not her own husband? The poor woman's overwrought." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind ticked rapidly. Nearby, Inspector Graves's face lit with the dark satisfaction of a man who senses his quarry is near. He strode off, already calling for one of his constables. A curious conversation later, while the party was dissolving under embarrassed murmurs and hasty farewells, Miss Marple encountered Victor Dupper lingering at the edge of the orchard. His face was pale beneath its usual warm tan, and he startled when she greeted him. Ah, Madame Marple, he said, twisting his hat between his long fingers. I I confess I am almost relieved to see you. So many here look at me as though I were already condemned. Perhaps they are simply unsettled. A murder does that to people. Perhaps. He hesitated. I wonder, did you know that Giles Rake offered to buy one of my canvases only last month? Insisted, really. Then, when I refused, he threatened to spread tales about me and Madame Trevilian. Foul lies. Emily was only ever kind, never improper. I swear this on my mother's grave. Miss Marple tilted her head. You refused to sell the painting. Was it by chance a portrait of Mrs. Trevilian? Dupper's shoulders slumped. We? Madame, I thought it was not finished, and might bring embarrassment. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I should have let him have it. And none of this, he broke off, swallowing hard. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. No, Mr. Dupper, one must never let oneself be blackmailed, in art or anything else. It only invites worse. He nodded mutely, eyes bright, then turned and walked away into the twilight. The calm before something breaks that evening found Miss Marple on her porch with her knitting. The roses were heavy on their stems, nodding in the dusk. Inside, Edna moved quietly about with a tray. A carriage rattled past, carrying Inspector Graves toward the Trevilians' manor. Miss Marple watched it go with a faint sigh. The net was tightening, but she feared it might close around the wrong creature, driven by petty scandals and human cowardice, rather than true understanding. She bent again to her needles, yet her mind was far from the simple pattern of yarn. Soon she knew something else must break open. A secret, a conscience, perhaps even another fragile life, and she meant to be ready when it did. A night of uneasy dreams that night. Marleycombe slept fitfully. Or rather, it pretended to sleep, for behind shuttered windows and dim lamps, hearts beat faster and minds churned with uneasy thoughts. Even the village dogs seemed restless, barking. Into the moonlit darkness its shadows. Only they perceived Dot at the vicarage. Reverend Granger struggled through his sermon dress, distracted by the knowledge that murder had touched his flock. At the Cresswell home, Clara cried quietly into her pillow, while her brother Timothy paced the corridor outside her room. At Orchard House, where the Trevilians lived, there was no light at all, only a grim, oppressive silence that made the maids whisper that the house itself seemed afraid. A troubled house by morning. The hush around Orchard House had turned into talk, for it was discovered that George Trevilian had not returned home at all. Emily, pale and hollow-eyed, told the maid she hadn't seen him since the morning before. Went off to London on urgent business, he said, Emily murmured, when Inspector Graves called again, her voice flat as cold iron. I hardly know what to believe anymore. Graves regarded her with thinly veiled skepticism. Did your husband take a valise? Or arrange for the carriage to the station? She shook her head. No, he only walked out with his gloves and walking stick, as though for a short stroll. Graves made a note in his small book, and yet he has not returned. No. Her hands tightened around the arm of her chair. And perhaps I should be glad of it. The inspector studied her with narrowed eyes, then stood abruptly. I will keep you informed, Mrs. Trevilian. When he had gone, Emily let her head sink into her hands. Miss Marple, who had come to call with a small posy of sweet peas, sat quietly beside her until the storm of silent tears passed. My dear, said Miss Marple gently, you are quite worn out. You must try to rest, though I know how hard it is, with so many fears pressing upon one's mind. Emily looked up, face blotched but grateful. How do you remain so calm, Miss Marple? Aren't you afraid, living all alone with so much wickedness about? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, my dear child, when one has lived as long as I have, one learns that evil seldom hides in shadows. More often, it sits in our parlors, drinks our tea, and smiles at our jokes. One must simply be watchful. The discovery at the edge of the wood that afternoon. The village was stirred by an ominous sight. Two local boys, who had been hunting for birds' nests beyond the Trevelyan property, returned breathless and wide-eyed. They spoke of something dark lying beneath a willow at the edge of the wood dot. It was Timothy Cresswell, who galloped into the village square to fetch Inspector Graves, nearly knocking over Mrs. Ellison in his haste. Within the hour, a small party of constables and curious onlookers had gathered at the spot. There, half concealed by drooping branches and last season's leaves, lay a hat, unmistakably George Trevelyan's fine felt hat, with a dark stain creeping through the brim. Nearby, the grass was trampled, and a broken branch suggested a struggle. But there was no sign of George Trevelyan himself. No body. Only that silent, accusing hat and a sense of dread that thickened the summer air. Graves stood frowning over it, hands on hips. Looks like we've a new turn, gentlemen. Either the man has come to harm, or he is at pains to make it seem so. Either way, it alters matters. Miss Marple, who had arrived with the vicar under the pretense of gathering wildflowers, examined the scene quietly. She noticed how the grass flattened in two separate directions, one set of tracks heavier than the other, and how a few drops of something dark, already crusted, dotted the ground further on Dot when she straightened. Her eyes met the vicar's. "People do love to make dramas out of small things," she said softly. "But sometimes, dear Mr. Granger, they overlook the real tragedy taking shape right under their feet." A telling conversation as they walked back to the lane. Victor Dupper came striding up, cheeks flushed. He clutched a bundle of papers, his sketches, by the look of it. Seeing Miss Marple, he paused. "Madame, have you heard? They say George Trevelyan is dead." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "That is what they whisper, Mr. Dupper, though we have no body yet, only signs of some mischief." Victor's throat worked. Then perhaps this nightmare will end. I mean the suspicion upon me. Surely if he is truly dead, they will see I had no cause." She gave him a mild, piercing look. "People are often more ready to hold on to their suspicions than to let them go, monsieur. One must be prepared for that." His shoulders slumped. "I fear you are right. Yet what am I to do? The villagers shun me. My patrons hesitate. My very reputation is smeared by mere association." "Then you must live as cleanly and patiently as you can," she said. "In time, the truth will push through the soil, like a crocus in winter. It always does." A shadow in the dusk that evening, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, knitting. Laid aside, watching the road that ran between Marleycombe and the distant railway station. The moon rose, and long shadows stole across the HEEROW at length. A lone figure appeared on the lane, tall, stooped slightly, moving with cautious, almost furtive steps. Miss Marple watched until he disappeared around a bend toward Orchard House. Only then did she draw a quiet breath. "Ah," she murmured to herself. "So you have returned at last, Mr. Trevelyan? We shall see what stories your shoes may tell tomorrow." She folded her hands in her lap, eyes thoughtful, heart heavy with the knowledge that Marleycombe's little garden of secrets was nowhere near done yielding up its deadly blooms. Miss Marple pays a call. The following morning dawned soft and pearly gray, the sun hidden behind a veil of delicate clouds. Marleycombe seemed hushed, almost waiting. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. Her little cottage garden was bright with nasturtiums and lavender, but she gave them only a passing glance. Her mind was set upon another sort of tending Dot. After a simple breakfast of porridge and wheat tea, she selected her best straw hat and set off along the lane toward Orchard House. It was not merely curiosity that spurred her steps. Over long years, Miss Marple had learned how very telling the first words after a storm might be, how human nature, still unsettled, sometimes betrayed truths it later learned to conceal. A strained household, she found Emily Trevelyan in the morning room, seated by the window with an untouched cup of tea before her. The room, though tastefully arranged, felt cold, as if the anxious thoughts of its mistress had seeped into the walls. "My dear, I thought I might bring you a few of my lemon biscuits," Miss Marple began gently. "They are a poor substitute for cheer, but sometimes a small sweetness helps." Emily tried to smile. "That is very kind. I fear I have quite lost my taste for food." Miss Marple settled herself opposite. Her eyes, mild and blue, wandered about the room, noting the faint scuff marks on the polished floor, a glove dropped carelessly on a side table, and an umbrella still damp at the tip. "And your husband, my dear? Has he come home at last?" Emily's hands trembled slightly as she folded them. "Yes, he returned late last night. Gave no explanation, only complained of a headache and went straight to bed. That must be a relief, at least to know he is safe." Emily's mouth twisted. Bitterly. Safe? I hardly know what that means anymore. He is here, certainly, but not safe, not from suspicion, nor from whatever has so unsettled him. He hardly looks me in the eye. Miss Marple reached across and patted her hand. Trust is a delicate thread, once frayed, but I have always found that when the truth emerges, it can mend even the most tattered ties, or else prove them not worth the darning. Emily looked down, her lashes dark with tears. "Do you truly believe the truth will come out?" "My dear Emily, it always does. The question is simply whether we are ready to see it." A careless remark as she left Orchard House, Miss Marple nearly collided with Victor Dupper, who was coming up the walk with a quick, almost guilty air. He carried a sheaf of sketches, the edges crumpled. "Oh, madame," he exclaimed, stepping back. "Forgive me. I did not expect visitors so early." "I might say the same," Miss Marple replied with a gentle arch of her brows. "Are you calling on Mrs. Trevelyan?" Victor flushed. "Yes, that is. I hope to discuss a commission. She has been kind enough to patronize my work before. And to be candid, business has been slow." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite understandable. Marleycombe is not precisely Paris, with wealthy patrons on every street. Though one must wonder at choosing to call so early, before most households have quite finished breakfast." Victor's eyes darted away. "Ah, well, perhaps you are right. It was foolish haste on my part." He made as if to go, but Miss Marple laid a light hand on his arm. "One question, if you'll indulge an old woman. You have been in the habit of sketching near the woods by the Willow Grove, have you not?" His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked genuinely startled. Yes, very often. It is a tranquil spot, indeed. Did you notice anyone there 2 days ago? Or anything out of the ordinary?" Victor hesitated, fingers tightening on his sketches. "No, nothing at all. I keep to myself. It is better that way." Miss Marple smiled, as if satisfied, but her eyes followed him keenly as he hurried away. When he was out of sight, she stood quite still, the morning breeze lifting her white hair. A delicate observation later that afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the village greengrocer. While Mr. Timmins weighed out her potatoes, she overheard a scrap of conversation between 2 young maids from Orchard House who were giggling by the apple bin. "And I swear it's true," said the taller one, eyes bright with gossip. "Cook found it in the laundry basket. A pair of gloves, all stained at the fingers. Blue-black it was, like ink or dye. She showed me before Mrs. Trevelyan could see." Miss Marple's hand paused in her reticule. "Stained gloves?" She repeated gently, turning to them with innocent curiosity. "Oh, yes, miss. Cook thought it might be from writing ink, but it wouldn't wash out proper. More like paint, she said, or blood gone dark. The other maid shivered. I wish you'd not say such things, Elsie. It fair gives me the creeps. Miss Marple thanked them with a kind word and completed her purchases. But as she walked home, her thoughts were far from potatoes and carrots. She recalled the ink-stained gloves found with Henry Cresswell's body. Gloves that had seemed so oddly out of place, almost planted, and now another pair, hidden among the Trevelyan linens. It was as if some grim signature was being repeated, meant to tie knots of suspicion ever tighter at an unsettling twilight that evening. Miss Marple sat on her garden bench, knitting in her lap forgotten. The air smelled of new-mown hay, sweet yet faintly decaying. Somewhere a dog barked, and a flock of starlings whirled overhead, their cries sharp against the quiet. She closed her eyes, thinking of George Trevelyan's furtive return, of Victor's nervous evasions, of Emily's haunted expression, of ink-stained gloves appearing like dark blossoms in unexpected places. When she opened her eyes again, they were calm and clear. She had seen human nature reveal itself in countless petty scandals over decades, from petty thefts to love affairs hidden behind lace curtains. Murder, she thought sadly, was only another bitter fruit of the same root dot, and Marleycomb's tree was not done bearing. A whisper in the dark, the days that followed brought a strange, almost oppressive quiet to Marleycombe. The villagers still talked, indeed. They talked more than ever, but there was a tension under the chatter, a sense of eyes watching from behind net curtains. Children were kept closer to home. Deliveries were made briskly, with forced smiles. It seemed to Miss Marple that even the birds were less inclined to sing. One evening, just as dusk deepened into a mauve twilight, she settled in her parlor to mend a small tear in her tablecloth. Outside, the wind was sighing through the hedgerows, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. She had lit only a single lamp, preferring the gentle shadows. Then came the sound, faint but distinct, of her gate latch clicking. Miss Marple paused, needle in mid-stitch. A moment later, there was a soft tapping at her door. An unexpected visitor. She rose and opened it to find Emily Trevelyan standing on the threshold. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the lamplight, and her gloved hands twisted at the handle of a small purse. "My dear child, come in at once," Miss Marple urged. "You look chilled to the bone." Emily stepped inside, glancing nervously over her shoulder before Miss Marple closed the door. Once seated, she struggled to compose herself, her breath quick and shallow. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If George knew, if anyone knew, but I can't bear it any longer." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "Tell me what troubles you." "There is something terribly wrong," Emily burst out, her voice shaking. "George has become a stranger to me. He says little, stays out late, sometimes all night. When he comes home, he looks haunted. I thought at first it was simply the strain, the gossip, the police, but there is more. I know there is." Miss Marple waited, giving her space to go on. "2 nights ago, I woke and found he was not beside me. I went downstairs, and there he was, by the drawing-room window, staring out into the garden. His hands were clenched, and he was muttering something I couldn't hear. When I spoke his name, he jumped as if struck. He told me I was imagining things, and went back to bed without another word." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "What am I to think? Could he truly be involved in Mr. Cresswell's death?" Miss Marple's quiet counsel. Miss Marple squeezed her hand. "Emily, I have lived long enough to know that fear can weave dreadful stories out of the flimsiest scraps. Your husband may be keeping secrets, but they are not necessarily the ones you dread." Emily gave a weak laugh. "You always sound so certain." "It is not certainty, my dear, only experience. However, if you truly wish to find peace, you must not shrink from learning the truth whatever it may be. Emily nodded, drawing a shaky breath. I believe you are right. But, oh, Miss Marple, I am so very afraid. Miss Marple stood and fetched a small glass of sherry, pressing it into Emily's hand. Then let us be afraid together, and bear it like sensible women. You are not alone, Emily. Remember that. After a time, Emily left, her steps lighter than when she had arrived. Miss Marple stood at the door watching until she disappeared down the lane, her slight figure soon swallowed by the deepening shadows. A warning delivered, it was not until later that night, when Miss Marple went to bolt her kitchen door, that she discovered something which made her pause. There, pinned to the wooden panel with an old hat-pin, was a slip of rough paper. The message was scrawled in a harsh, uneven hand. Peep out of matters that do not concern you, old lady. If you value your peace. Miss Marple stood very still, reading the words twice, then thrice. Her expression did not change. At last she removed the paper, folded it neatly, and placed it on the kitchen dresser. A lesser woman might have trembled. Miss Marple, however, merely put on the kettle. As it whistled to life, she thought how very human it was, the attempt to frighten someone off with anonymous threats. She had seen it before in village disputes over land boundaries, over inheritance, even over a wandering husband. Murder simply made the stakes higher and the notes more crude. But it told her one important thing. Someone in Marleycombe was frightened enough to wish her silence. And that, she reflected with a tiny smile, was more revealing than any confession. The next morning's surprise, when she awoke the following morning, Marleycombe seemed bathed in a fragile, almost deceptive calm. The sky was washed clean by the night's rain. Birds trilled from the hedgerows, and a milk cart clattered cheerfully down the lane. Miss Marple, dressed in a soft gray cardigan, took her basket and went out to collect a few herbs from her kitchen garden. There she found young Ned Partridge, the stable boy from Orchard House, standing by her gate, cap in hand. He looked ill at ease, shuffling his feet. "Good morning, Ned," she said kindly. "You're up early." "Begging your pardon, miss," he stammered. "I didn't like to bother you, but, well, I seen something last night." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "And what might that be?" "It were up by the old orchard," Ned whispered, glancing about as though the trees might be listening. "Near where they found Mr. Cresswell. I were talking a short cut home from the public house, and I seen a lantern moving, like someone hunting for something in the grass. When I got closer, whoever it was put it out sudden like. I didn't see you, but they was wearing dark clothes. Slipped off into the trees soon as they heard me." Miss Marple thanked him warmly and pressed a shilling into his hand for his trouble. As he loped away, she stood very still, her mind turning over this fresh morsel. Someone was still searching the orchard. For what? And why risk it, with the whole village on edge and the police still paying visits? The mystery, it seemed, was deepening its roots, and soon, Miss Marple suspected, it would bear its bitter fruit at last. A walk to the orchard the next day dawned with a peculiar brightness, the sort that made Marleycombe look almost painfully innocent. Sunlight glimmered on dew-jeweled hedges, and swallows swooped low over the cottage roofs. Yet Miss Marple found herself oddly restless. Her knitting lay untouched on the side table, and the morning paper's tidings of distant political squabbles seemed quite irrelevant compared to the anxious little world of her village. She could not stop thinking of Ned Partridge's report, a lantern in the orchard, someone creeping through the wet grass under cover of darkness. It all suggested that some secret yet lay hidden out there among the twisted old apple trees. So, after luncheon, she tied on her straw hat, slipped a pair of sturdy shoes over her stockings, and set off down the lane. She carried a small wicker basket. It always helped to look harmlessly occupied, and resolved to gather a few wild blackberries on her way. The orchard's hush, the orchard. stood on the edge of Marleycombe, past a tangle of elder bushes and a broken stone wall half lost under ivy. It belonged to the old Danforth estate, which had been empty these last 5 years. The trees were thick and rather neglected, their branches heavy with unpicked fruit that already lay rotting beneath in sugary brown heaps. Bees buzzed lazily. Among the fallen apples, Miss Marple walked slowly between the rows, pausing now and then to stoop and examine the ground. The grass here was flattened in odd places. Once or twice she spotted faint disturbances in the damp earth, as though someone had been digging or pressing something into the soil. She was bending to inspect a particularly suspicious patch when a sound reached her ears, the crack of a twig, and then a quick intake of breath. Miss Marple straightened, her heart giving a tiny leap. She turned, and there, half hidden behind a gnarled tree, stood George Trevelyan. A fraught encounter for a moment. They regarded each other in perfect silence. George looked gaunt and strained, as though sleep had been a stranger to him for many nights. His coat was unbuttoned, his collar slightly askew. One hand was thrust deep into his pocket. The other clutched a crushed felt hat. "Why, Mr. Trevelyan?" Miss Marple said lightly, though she could feel her own pulse fluttering. "How you startled me. I thought I had this orchard all to myself." George attempted a smile, which only managed to twist one side of his mouth. "I needed a walk. Some air. Been cooped up too long in that house. I quite understand. It does a person good to get away from drawn curtains and heavy whispers. Though you seem rather far from the usual footpaths." He opened his mouth, as if to respond, then closed it again. A faint flush rose on his hollow cheeks. Miss Marple watched him with gentle, unwavering eyes. "Are you quite well, Mr. Trevelyan?" she asked. "Yes, yes, of course," he muttered. Then, with sudden sharpness, "Why shouldn't I be? Is there more gossip now? More stories?" "No new stories that I have heard," Miss Marple replied softly. "Only the old ones, which do not seem to grow any clearer." George seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging. He brushed past her abruptly, disappearing through the orchard with quick, uneven strides. Miss Marple stood very still, listening to the retreating rustle of leaves. When all was quiet again, she resumed her careful circuit, a small discovery near the far edge of the orchard. Beneath an ancient pear tree, she found something curious indeed. Half buried in the moist soil was a scrap of cloth, white linen, stained darkly at one edge. Miss Marple extracted it with delicate fingers. It was the cuff of a man's shirt, torn clean away at the seam. The dark stains were dry now, but she did not need much imagination to guess. They had once been vivid red. She wrapped the piece in a clean handkerchief and placed it at the bottom of her basket, covering it with a few blackberries. Then she stood for a time, gazing out across the orchard with its dappled shadows. Her mind ran in quiet, steady channels, sorting this new puzzle piece into place among all the rest. The vicarage tebby. Late afternoon, Miss Marple found herself seated in the cheerful sunlit drawing-room of the vicarage, enjoying a dish of seed cake and listening to the vicar's wife, Mrs. Drayton, discuss the forthcoming church bazaar. The talk was of jam stalls, raffles, and lace-table runners. It might have been any ordinary village afternoon, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far from raffles. She excused herself a little earlier than usual and walked home. Once there, she laid the torn cuff upon her kitchen table. For a long while, she simply regarded it, as though expecting it to speak. Then she fetched her small magnifying glass and examined the stitches. They were fine, precise, the work of an expensive tailor. Not the sort of shirt a stable hand or farm laborer would wear. No, indeed. This belonged to someone of means, someone careful about appearances. And somewhere, Miss Marple felt sure, there was another clue, perhaps no larger than a grain of dust that would finally link these fragments together. A decision made that evening, as twilight once more settled over Marleycombe, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, her knitting lying idle in her lap. Her blue eyes were thoughtful, but there was also a spark of quiet resolution. It was time. She decided to pay a visit to Inspector Graves. The police had grown rather too content with their narrow circle of suspects. A nudge in the right direction might prevent a dreadful mistake, or perhaps even draw the true criminal into the open. And as she prepared her mind for that delicate conversation, Miss Marple felt again that chill little whisper of danger. Someone in Marleycombe was desperate enough to skulk through orchards by night, to leave threats pinned to cottage doors, and perhaps, if cornered, to do far worse. But that was a risk she was willing to face. For Miss Marple understood, better than most, that the greatest evil often wore the most courteous smiles, and she was not yet done unraveling the smiling masks of Marleycombe. A visit to the station. Miss Marple did not sleep particularly well that night. Though the village seemed hushed under its velvet summer darkness, her thoughts kept circling the orchard, the torn cuff, and George Trevelyan's haunted face. By morning, she had resolved upon a quiet but firm course of action. So it was that just after 10 o'clock she found herself approaching the small stone building that served as Marleycombe's police station. It looked almost absurdly peaceful, with a rose bush nodding by the door and a lazy tabby cat stretched across the step. But inside, Miss Marple suspected, things were far less tranquil. Inspector Graves listens. With impatience, Inspector Graves received her in his cramped office, surrounded by battered filing cabinets and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco. He rose politely enough, though there was a faint tightening around his mouth that suggested he feared another well-meaning villager anxious to share gossip. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a stiff little bow, "how can I help you this morning?" "I won't take up too much of your time, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, settling herself primly into a hard wooden chair. "But I thought it only right to bring you something I discovered yesterday. Quite by accident, of course." She reached into her basket and drew out the handkerchief-wrapped cuff, placing it gently on his desk. Graves raised his eyebrows, then unwrapped it with deliberate care. As he held it up to the light, his expression shifted from irritation to wary interest. "Found in the orchard beyond the old Danforth property," Miss Marple added helpfully. "I was gathering blackberries. You can see the dark staining. Quite unmistakable, I should think." Graves turned the fabric over in his hands. "It does appear to be blood," he admitted, "but it could be older than our case. That orchard's been a gathering spot for village children and courting couples for decades." "That is very true," Miss Marple agreed. "Still, it seems a peculiar coincidence, especially given that a lantern was seen there late 2 nights ago." Graves shot her a sharp look. "You've been speaking to Ned Partridge, then?" "One does hear things in Marleycombe, Inspector, and I should hate to think of an innocent person suffering because some little clue was overlooked." A quiet nudge. Graves leaned back in his chair, the torn cuff still in his hand. "Miss Marple, with respect, we have ample cause to pursue our current line of inquiry. George Trevelyan had both motive and opportunity. His debts were considerable, and by several accounts he quarreled violently with Mr. Swithin only a day before the murder." "Yes, quite. But George is also very young and rather hot-headed, just the sort to shout threats he doesn't truly mean, and so very transparent. I find that real guilt often lies with those who seem most calm, most obliging." The inspector drummed his fingers on the desk. "You've someone else in mind?" "Oh, dear me, no. That would be most improper of me. I merely think it would be wise to look carefully at the financial papers of all concerned, and perhaps at any old scandals which might have lain dormant until now. Sometimes resentments smolder for years, you know, before they flare up most tragically." She spoke with such gentle authority that Graves found himself grudgingly noting it down. Miss Marple watched him with that serene, almost bird-like gaze which so often made cleverer men feel subtly maneuvered. Outside the station, when she emerged once more into the bright street, Miss Marple paused to draw in a deep breath. A few villagers were about, nodding to her respectfully. She saw young Elsie Drummond leaving the bakery, arms full of crusty loaves, and old Mr. Pritchard arguing with the milkman at the corner. Life went on, apparently unchanged, but beneath it all she could sense the tremor of suspicion running like an underground stream. She had taken only a few steps when she nearly collided with Mrs. Halbert, the village postmistress, who was bustling along with a satchel of letters. "Oh, Miss Marple!" Mrs. Halbert exclaimed, catching her breath. "I was just thinking how dreadful all this is. Everyone's so on edge. People coming in for their post, hoping for something to distract them from the talk of murder." "Yes, it has been most trying," Miss Marple agreed, "though I imagine you've noticed more than most. Letters can tell a great deal, even simply by who receives them." Mrs. Halbert flushed slightly. "Well, I shouldn't gossip, but you know how it is in a small place. When a letter comes 3 days in a row from London, addressed in the same fine lady's hand, well, one puts 2 and 2 together." Miss Marple gave her an encouraging little smile. "And whose doorstep has London been visiting lately?" Mrs. Halbert dropped her voice. "Why, Mrs. Charteris, though her husband's been dead these 2 years. It seems odd, and she's been terribly on edge, haven't you noticed? Jumping like a hare at every unexpected knock." Another seed of suspicion, Miss Marple walked slowly homeward, pondering this new scrap of information. She had never much cared for Mrs. Charteris. The woman's sweetness struck her as too practiced, her soft sighs just a shade too theatrical. Still, it was a long step from receiving clandestine letters to committing murder. Yet sometimes it was precisely the longing for secrecy, or the terror of exposure, that drove otherwise respectable people to desperate measures. And the ink-stained gloves that had given this case its queer name kept returning to Miss Marple's mind. Who had owned them, and what had they written? A quiet evening, but a mind still working that evening. Miss Marple sat by her lamp reading, over a small collection of notes she had jotted in her neat, delicate handwriting. A list of names, odd remarks overheard in shop queues, bits of village history that most had long forgotten. Outside, the owls began their plaintive calls. Somewhere far off a dog barked once, then fell silent. Miss Marple set down her pen and gazed into the shadows beyond her window. Her eyes were gentle, but very bright. She was close now. She could feel it. The pieces were beginning to fit, but there remained a missing link, a simple human motive that would tie everything neatly together. And when she found it, she feared Marley Combe might have to face an even uglier truth than mere murder. Tea at Laurel Cottage. The next afternoon found Miss Marple making her way to Laurel Cottage, where Mrs. Charteris lived behind prim white shutters and a climbing tangle of wisteria. It was a house that always looked to be holding its breath. Immaculate, scented faintly of lavender polish, and arranged so precisely that it felt like trespass to wrinkle a cushion. Mrs. Charteris herself opened the door, wearing a delicate muslin dress of pale blue that did little to hide the drawn quality of her face. Her greeting was all warmth, though her eyes darted just a touch too quickly. "Miss Marple, how perfectly lovely. Do come in. It's such a comfort to see a friendly face these days. Everything in the village seems turned upside down, doesn't it?" "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently. "These dreadful events have unsettled us all. I do hope you're bearing up." Mrs. Charteris led her into a sitting room, awash with embroidered cushions and silver-framed photographs. She poured out tea with a slight tremor in her hands. "Oh, I try my best, dear Miss Marple, but I hardly sleep. And the stories one hears, I do so long for it all to be over. Poor Mr. Swithin and young George. Such a disgrace to have our village spoken of in the same breath as murder. A subtle line of questioning Miss Marple accepted her cup and took a thoughtful sip. Yes, it is all most distressing, though perhaps not so surprising. I've always found that small communities can be quite as dangerous as large cities. Once certain little secrets are brought into the light, Mrs. Charteris stiffened almost imperceptibly. Little secrets? My dear Miss Marple, surely you don't mean to say anyone respectable could be mixed up in this horror? One never knows, said Miss Marple mildly. I remember a case in Little Ledbury where a woman ran off with a draper's assistant, after poisoning her husband's tea for nearly a year. No one suspected a thing. She was most devoted in arranging the church flowers. There was a brittle laugh from Mrs. Charteris, but her eyes flickered. She set down her teacup a shade, too carefully. Miss Marple let a small silence fall, as though lost in private reminiscence. In reality, she was watching how Mrs. Charteris's fingers worried the edge of her handkerchief, how her breathing had grown shallow, a slip of the tongue at. Last, Mrs. Charteris could not seem to bear the silence. It's simply dreadful to think we're all being watched, judged. Why, only yesterday, Inspector Graves stopped me in the lane to ask the most peculiar questions about my correspondence, if you please. As though I might write such letters, or receive them, that could be of any interest. Miss Marple looked up quickly. Oh? But I thought you did have quite regular letters from town. From an old family friend, was it? Or perhaps someone newly acquainted? The color drained from Mrs. Charteris's face. That is only my cousin. Julia writes from London, and a few tradespeople. Nothing that could possibly concern a murder investigation. She gave a little strangled laugh, dabbing at her lips. How absurd you must think me, carrying on so. Not at all, Miss Marple said kindly. It is only natural to be uneasy. But sometimes, my dear, when people go to great lengths to hide quite innocent things, it gives rise to very dark suspicions. A small but telling crack. There was a long pause. Outside, a cart rumbled by, and the thin cry of a baby drifted on the warm air. In that space, Miss Marple saw it happen, saw the way Mrs. Charteris's eyes grew wet. Her mouth worked, as though shaping words she did not quite dare utter. Then, very softly, Mrs. Charteris whispered, I did receive a letter the morning. Mr. Swithin was found, but it was destroyed, by accident, of course. A lamp overturned on my writing desk. I scarcely read it through before it was lost. Such a pity, Miss Marple said, her voice almost a whisper in return. Letters can be so clarifying, and so very dangerous, too, if misunderstood. Mrs. Charteris twisted her handkerchief until the lace nearly tore. But it was only family matters, quite dull. Nothing anyone need trouble over. Of course, Miss Marple murmured. She rose then, brushing imaginary crumbs from her skirt. I mustn't impose any longer. You've been most gracious, my dear, and do try to sleep tonight. Outside again, and thinking hard as she walked back along the lane, Miss Marple's thoughts whirled like autumn leaves. A letter burned the morning after a murder, a woman near tears at the slightest pressure. And if Mrs. Charteris feared exposure so terribly, it might be not for murder at all, but for something else that still tied back to this tragic affair. She paused at the gate to adjust her hat, letting her gaze drift over Marleycomb's sunlit rooftops. Somewhere behind those tidy hedges lay the final truth. But it would take more than a tea visit to draw it out. A new resolution that evening. Miss Marple sat once more with her notebook, carefully underlining 3 names. Mrs. Charteris, for her anxious lies. Mr. Follow, the solicitor, whose visits to certain cottages had grown oddly frequent. Young Elsie Drummond, who had been seen near the orchard with a basket she claimed was empty, though its bottom was stained a peculiar rusty shade dot, and somewhere among them, or perhaps in their intersection, lay the key to the blood-stained cuff and the ink-stained gloves. Miss Marple closed her book with a soft sigh. Tomorrow, she decided, she would take a walk to the churchyard. People often spoke more freely among graves, where they imagined the dead alone could overhear. Among the graves, the next morning broke bright and deceptively cheerful, with sunlight pouring across Marleycomb's churchyard. Sparrows flitted between headstones as though playing tag, and the stone angels seemed to smile in the fresh light. Miss Marple arrived just after 10 o'clock, ostensibly to tidy her parents' grave. She brought a small basket with fresh pansies, a pair of shears, and a mind sharp as ever, for in her long experience, there was no better place to overhear confidences than among the dead Dot, as she clipped away tired marigold heads. Her ear caught the gentle murmur of two voices drifting from the path nearby. She did not look up, merely paused in her work, hands folded on the basket rim. Idle gossip, or not quite, it was Mrs. Willow, the vicar's wife, speaking in hushed yet eager tones to Miss Hetty Conder, who managed the post office. Such a dreadful business, Mrs. Willow was saying. And to think Elsie Drummond was seen weeping by the lich gate only yesterday afternoon. Quite undone. Poor girl. I told Mr. Willow I feared she might take ill. Miss Conder gave a sniff. Grief, is it? Or fright? You mark my words, that young woman knows more than she ought. There's been whispers she was sweet on Mr. Swithin, though he was never one to court openly. Miss Marple's hands were perfectly still. Not so very long ago, she had noticed how Elsie's apron seemed oddly crumpled, as though clenched in trembling fists. And now this suggestion of a private tenderness, it lent new flavor to a line of thought she had barely begun to explore. Little more pressure deciding the moment was too ripe to waste, Miss Marple rose and walked slowly over. Forgive me for intruding, my dears. My hearing isn't what it once was, but I couldn't help catching poor Elsie's name. Surely you aren't implying the girl had anything to do with this tragedy? Oh no, dear Miss Marple, fluttered Mrs. Willow, though her eyes were bright with the thrill of scandal. Only that she's terribly overwrought. You know how simple hearts sometimes get tangled in, well, situations beyond them. Miss Conder gave a sniff, and she was seen coming from Mr. Fallow's office, in tears again. I'd wager there's some papers drawn up she didn't understand a whit of, or perhaps wished she hadn't signed at all. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Papers? My, that does sound curious. Though I imagine most legal matters are dreadfully dry. You may imagine so, said Miss Conder with relish, but I'd say there's more excitement behind Mr. Fallow's ledgers than any of us guessed. Why, even Mrs. Charteris has been closeted with him twice this week, and never looked quite the same after. A lonely figure the two women soon drifted away, leaving Miss Marple to ponder by a sun-warmed stone angel. A cluster of bluebells nodded by her feet. Nearby, she noticed Elsie Drummond herself, sitting on the low wall near the war memorial, hands twisting together. Miss Marple approached as quietly as dew. Such a peaceful morning, isn't it, Elsie? Though perhaps peace is sometimes hardest to bear when one's heart is troubled. Elsie started. Her eyes were swollen, lashes clumped into spikes. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. I just needed some air. Of course, my dear. I often come here myself when matters weigh on me. I find the company of those who can't reply is strangely soothing. Elsie gave a tiny, broken laugh. Yes, perhaps because they can't judge you. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. Elsie, my dear child, whatever grief or fear burdens you, I hope you'll remember that silence can be far crueler than the truth. Sometimes a small confession to someone who means you no harm can ease dreadful torments. A crack in the dame Elsie's throat worked. Her lips parted, closed again. Then, in a rush so quiet it was nearly lost to the rustle of leaves, she whispered, "I only wanted him to care for me. He promised, Mr. Swithin did. He promised he'd help me. But then he changed. Started saying I was a silly girl who dreamed too much." She gulped air, eyes squeezed shut. "And then that letter came, telling him to end it, or else. He laughed about it, said whoever wrote it couldn't prove a thing. But I saw how he fretted, miss, how he looked over his shoulder. That's why I went to Mr. Fallow, to see if there was any money left for me. In case. Her words dissolved into tears. Miss Marple drew her close, patting her shoulder with soft, motherly patience. Her mind, meanwhile, raced a letter, threats, Mr. Fallow, Mrs. Charteris, each clue twisted tighter about the yarn. Same old trunk, roots snaking together under Marley Comb's prim flower beds. And somewhere beneath all that polite earth lay murder. Miss Marple makes up her mind when Elsie's sobs had quieted. Miss Marple left her with a promise of tea and a cherry cake at the cottage. Then she returned home, sat by her neat escritoire, and wrote 2 very deliberate notes, one inviting Mr. Fallow to call upon her the next afternoon, the other suggesting Mrs. Charteris might join her for tea-dot as she blotted the envelopes. She smiled, a small, almost regretful smile, for Miss Marple knew well that in matters of human hearts it was rarely the obvious quarrel that ended in blood, but the hidden terror of exposure. And tomorrow she meant to expose everything. Tea at Dane's cottage the next afternoon dawned sultry and oppressive, clouds hanging low over Marley Combe as if conspiring to press secrets from the earth. Miss Marple moved about Dane's cottage with particular care, setting out her best cups, delicate bone china with a rim of forget-me-nots, and arranging a plate of small seed cakes precisely at the center of the table. She had extended invitations to 2 very different visitors, Mr. Fallow, with his cautious legal mind, and Mrs. Charteris, who brought with her an air of expensive perfumes and faint impatience. As if always slightly vexed by the inadequacy of the world, Miss Marple believed profoundly in the value of a neutral drawing-room. Many confessions, some even criminal, had been coaxed out under her crocheted antimacassars. The comforting scent of lavender polish, the ticking clock on the mantel, the gentle insistence of tea, all these were more effective than a magistrate's bench. Polite beginnings, Mrs. Charteris arrived first, her gloves the color of pale primroses, her smile quick and brittle. "My dear Miss Marple, how very kind. Though I must admit I hadn't expected such urgency in your little note." "Oh, it is nothing very dramatic," Miss Marple assured her. "Only that I felt it was time we 2 ladies spoke plainly. Marleycombe is a small village, you see. Whisperings take on lives of their own." Before Mrs. Charteris could reply, Mr. Fallow was announced by Miss Marple's maid. He entered with a harried look, a thin film of perspiration on his brow, despite the gentle pace of his walk from the till. "Office." The solicitor bowed over Miss Marple's hand, offered a stiff nod to Mrs. Charteris, and sat down heavily. Tea was poured, polite remarks made about the weather, and Miss Marple listened with half an ear to the ritual. Her true attention lay in tiny tremors, Mrs. Charteris's hand hovering an instant too long at her throat, Mr. Fallow's eyes darting to the window whenever a carriage passed. A careful turn of conversation. "I have been thinking," Miss Marple said presently, stirring her cup, "how very unfortunate it is for a respectable village to suffer such scandal. Poor Mr. Swithin, dead under such dreadful circumstances. And now the poor Drummond girl wandering about like a ghost." She paused. Neither of her guests spoke, so she went on with mild authority. "Of course, these things never stay buried. A girl weeping by gravestones, visits to a solicitor that excite curiosity. One wonders, Mr. Fallow, if your office has not been rather too busy of late?" Fallow cleared his throat. Miss Marple, you surely cannot expect me to betray private matters. Oh, of course not, she agreed with gentle dismissal. Only, secrecy in small places often breeds suspicion where none need exist. And we wouldn't wish that upon Mrs. Charteris, would we? Not when she has already borne so much since the loss of her husband. Mrs. Charteris stiffened, her cup rattling slightly in its saucer. I fail to see how my affairs concern anyone here. An unexpected tremor, Miss Marple tilted her head. But, dear lady, it is precisely because they concern you that they concern all of us. I gather there were rather urgent conversations between yourself and Mr. Fallow not long before Mr. Swithin's death. Mrs. Charteris's face went pale, two bright flags of color standing out on cheeks. Her breath quickened. That is vile gossip. How dare you? How dare anyone imply? My dear, no one implies anything improper, Miss Marple interrupted softly. At least not yet. I only thought, in kindness, you might wish to explain why a note in your hand, found by the police among Mr. Swithin's things, would caution him to leave matters as they stand, or all shall be exposed. Charteris swayed as if struck. Her mouth opened, closed again. Mr. Fallow half rose, then sat back with a strangled noise. The first crack. Finally Mrs. Charteris whispered, I did write to him. I begged him to stop pursuing that dreadful claim he had threatened. It would have dragged my late husband's dealings into the open. Certain speculative investments that could ruin my son's prospects if they were made public. Mr. Swithin knew exactly how to twist matters. I offered him money to stay silent. So you see, Miss Marple said quietly, turning to Mr. Fallow, the danger was not merely to feelings, but to reputations, inheritances, even to future marriages. Fallow ran a hand over his face. I only advised Mrs. Charteris how best to protect her family. I swear I never thought harm would come to Mr. Swithin. I was as shocked as anyone. Miss Marple gave a tiny nod. And yet harm did come, which means someone else decided to prevent him from speaking permanently. Tell me, Mr. Fallow, did you also handle certain transfers of property from Mr. Swithin shortly before his death? The solicitor flinched. I did. He was settling small parcels of land. I thought it odd, but you did not inquire too closely, Miss Marple finished, because it was more convenient not to. A private revelation, when at last her guests departed, Mrs. Charteris trembling, Mr. Fallow mopping his brow. Miss Marple sat very still in her neat parlor, hands folded on her lap. Her blue eyes were bright with deep, quiet calculation. People do so hate direct questions, she murmured to herself. Much better to let them wrestle with their own fear. It shows more than any confession ever could. She rose then, to draw the curtains against the dimming afternoon. Somewhere in Marleycombe, the true murderer was growing uneasy. Tomorrow, she would set the final piece in motion, and by evening, the village would know everything. An invitation to unease Marleycombe awoke the next morning under a peculiar hush. Even the birds seemed more subdued, as though they too sensed that something was quietly shifting beneath the village's polite surface. Miss Marple, however, appeared, entirely at her ease. After a modest breakfast, she spent an hour among her roses, carefully deadheading the spent blooms, her secateurs snipping with crisp precision. Anyone passing the little gate of Dane's cottage would have thought her mind fixed solely on horticulture, yet beneath her calm expression lay an intricate lattice of thought. Threads of gossip, whispered confessions, overlooked gestures. She teased them together like delicate lace, each revelation a knot or loop, drawing her closer to the truth. At 10:30, she laid aside her gardening gloves, dusted her hands, and went inside to write several brief notes. Each was worded with careful vagueness, enough to spark curiosity and perhaps a prickle of alarm. By noon, The notes had been dispatched by young George Crispin, the milkman's eager son. Tea at the vicarage. The first of these notes arrived at the vicarage, where the Reverend Mr. Linton was deep in his weekly sermon revisions. Opening this envelope with mild surprise, he read Miss Marple's neat, slanting hand. "Dear Mr. Linton, might I trouble you for the favor of your company at Dane's cottage tomorrow at 4? A matter of grave concern to our dear Marleycombe requires discreet discussion. Yours sincerely, J. Marple." The vicar's brows knit. It was not like Miss Marple to traffic in melodrama. He found himself vaguely unsettled, as though a long-standing certainty had been gently nudged askew. A ripple through the village meanwhile. At Rosecroft House, Mrs. Charteris read her own note with hands that trembled despite her best efforts. By the time she folded the slip of paper and pressed it into her reticule, a thin sheen of perspiration shone on her upper lip. Mr. Fallow, seated in his office surrounded by ledgers and crusted envelopes, received his summons with a low groan. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. His mind flitted through deeds, testaments, small improprieties, all the cobwebs of his discreet profession. Could Miss Marple truly have uncovered something damning? And elsewhere still, in a neat sunlit parlor on Holly Lane, someone received their note in silence, mouth flattening to a hard line. A pair of gloved hands, not fine ladies' gloves, but sturdy leather, tightened around the paper until it crumpled. Then the figure rose abruptly, crossing to the mantel to toss the note into the fireplace, watching it blacken and curl. A confidential conversation late that afternoon. Miss Marple paid a private call on Inspector Trevelyan at the police station. She found him in a cramped office, littered with reports and heavy with the scent of stale pipe smoke. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, half rising, "you catch me in the very midst of preparing an update for the chief constable. What can I do?" "For you? I shan't keep you long," she said, smiling. "Only I thought you ought to know that I have arranged a small gathering at Dane's cottage tomorrow afternoon. I believe it will quite clarify matters. If you would be so good as to come, perhaps prepared for a most uncomfortable disclosure." Trevelyan's eyes narrowed. "Are you telling me, madam, that you intend to flush out the murderer yourself?" "Oh, dear me, no," Miss Marple said lightly. "Merely that I have reason to believe certain truths will emerge if the right people are brought together. You have always struck me as admirably quick to act when the moment demands." The inspector grunted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll be there, never fear. But mind, I'd rather you didn't place yourself at risk." Miss Marple's smile softened. "My dear inspector, I am far too old to be worth murdering. At least, I should hope so. Good day to you." The stillness before revelation that evening, Marleycombe seemed suspended in expectation. Lamps lit up one by one across the village, tiny beacons against the deepening blue. Behind curtained windows, husbands and wives spoke in low tones. Children were sent to bed early, and servants lingered by kitchen doors, speculating in whispers. Inside Dane's cottage, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles clicking steadily as the fire sighed on the hearth. To an outsider she might have appeared drowsy, even inattentive, her eyelids lowering as though from age. But her mind was keen and wholly alert, rehearsing each conversation she had observed over the past weeks, each startled glance, each slip of the tongue. Tomorrow, she felt sure, the final thread would tug free. She laid aside her work at last and folded her hands in her lap, gazing into the flames. "It is quite extraordinary," she murmured, "how small vanities and resentments, when nurtured in silence, can grow into the most dreadful resolves." And somewhere beyond her warm little sitting room, the person who feared exposure the most lay awake in a cold sweat, heart galloping at every distant footstep. A gathering at Dane's cottage at precisely 4 o'clock the next afternoon. Dane's cottage became the quiet pivot upon which Marleycombe's collective anxiety turned. A faint scent of lavender polish mingled with the aroma of freshly baked seed. Cake that Miss Marple's housekeeper, Mary, had laid out on the sideboard. The little sitting room was bright with sunlight filtered through lace curtains. Yet the atmosphere was undeniably tense. Miss Marple herself wore a soft dove-gray cardigan and a small cameo brooch at her throat. She greeted each of her guests with gentle courtesy, offering tea as though this were no more than one of her usual pleasant afternoons. But behind her kindly blue eyes was a sharp, unrelenting watchfulness. Guests arrive with secrets. Mr. Fallow was among the first to arrive, his hands fidgeting with his hat brim. His greeting was slightly breathless. "A very fine afternoon, Miss Marple, though perhaps a touch warm for serious matters, yes," Miss Marple finished for him gently. "Do sit down, Mr. Fallow." Soon after, Mrs. Charteris entered, draped in silks and a faint air of defeat. Her eyes darted to each corner of the room as though hoping the walls might conceal an escape. The vicar and his wife came together, their faces carefully composed. Reverend Linton's hand rested lightly on Mrs. Linton's arm, as though steadying them both for something unpleasant. Inspector Trevelyan arrived last, standing near the door with a wary, assessing expression. He offered Miss Marple a small nod of readiness. Notably absent was the person Miss Marple most expected to resist this gathering. She checked the clock on the mantel, her expression betraying neither triumph nor concern. It was only a minute later that heavy footsteps sounded. On the path, the door swung open, and Mr. Amos Ridley filled the frame. His cap was in his hands, his hair damp at the temples. "Beg pardon for being a trifle late, Miss Marple," he muttered. "I had something to see to on the way." "Not at all, Mr. Ridley. Please come in. I am most grateful you could join us." Miss Marple speaks plainly. Once tea had been served and sipped with only strained small talk to sustain it. Miss Marple set aside her cup. Her hands rested lightly in her lap. "My dear friends," she began, in that soft, slightly tremulous voice that so often caused people to underestimate her, "you must forgive the rather dramatic summons. I assure you I dislike theatrics. But in this case, I believe candor is our only hope of preserving what peace Marleycombe may yet possess." She looked slowly from one face to the next. "We have lived under the shadow of Mr. Denning's dreadful murder for weeks now. During that time, rumors have run unchecked. Suspicions have poisoned our kindly village ways, and certain secrets, quite old ones, in some cases, have come perilously close to destroying more than reputations." Mrs. Charteris gave a visible start. Mr. Fallow coughed and tugged at his collar. Ridley merely folded his arms across his broad chest and stared at the carpet. However, Miss Marple continued gently, "I think it best if the truth is spoken now while we are all gathered, rather than dragged out by scandal later." A subtle probe, she turned her eyes to Mr. Fallow. "You, sir, were so dreadfully worried about that bequest Mr. Denning made to your sister's children. You feared people might think you profited by his death, especially given the irregular nature of some old investments you once handled for him." Fallow's face turned the color of weak milk. I never—" "Oh, you never harmed him," Miss Marple assured him, with a little pat of her hand. "You merely worried that others would think you had." Then her gaze swept to Mrs. Charteris. "And dear Mrs. Charteris, who feared old indiscretions might come to light, matters quite unrelated to murder, I assure you, though I understand how deeply one might dread the embarrassment." Mrs. Charteris's hand flew to her throat. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she managed a stiff little nod. Finally, Miss Marple's mild eyes rested on Ridley. "But you, Mr. Ridley, were seen on more than one occasion near Mr. Denning's workshop after dark, though you told Inspector Trevelyan you'd had no dealings with him." Ridley's mouth tightened. "That weren't any business o' yours, ma'am." "Oh, but it is now," Miss Marple said almost tenderly. "Because, you see, Someone who wore sturdy work gloves, often stained with oil, and yes, quite lately, with ink, must have been inside that workshop the very evening Mr. Denning died. The killer left a faint smear of blue-black on the door latch, mixed with something else. I expect the inspector can tell us what that was. Inspector Trevelyan stepped forward, producing a small glass vial from his pocket. We found residue of a cleaning solvent. Used to wipe tools or blood. Ridley's face was a mask of fury. "You old busybody." The net tightens, he surged to his feet, but the inspector had anticipated this. With a curt signal, a uniformed constable entered from the hall, blocking Ridley's exit. "Sit down, Ridley," Trevelyan said sharply. "We'll hear Miss Marple out. Then you'll accompany us to the station." Ridley sank back, breathing hard, his glare fixed on Miss Marple. She did not flinch. "It was jealousy, wasn't it? You believed Mr. Denning had cheated you on that contract for additional sheds. Or perhaps you were more incensed over the money you thought he owed your cousin. In such tempers, men sometimes strike out without thinking. And afterward, panic does the rest." There was a dreadful silence, and Ridley slumped, shoulders bowing. "He laughed at me," he muttered hoarsely. "Called me a thick-headed lout. Sighed I couldn't read a contract proper if it were painted on my barn door. I only meant to give him a fright." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, as though offering a silent prayer. When she opened them again, they were kind but infinitely sad. "The shadow lifts. Thank you, Mr. Ridley," she said quietly. "It is a dreadful thing you have done, but hiding from it would have made even worse. Misery for all concerned." The room seemed to exhale at once. Mrs. Charteris sobbed into her handkerchief. Mr. Fallow bent forward, pressing his forehead into his palms. The vicar murmured a soft prayer. Inspector Trevelyan placed a firm hand on Ridley's shoulder. "We'll finish this at the station." As they escorted the defeated man out, Miss Marple remained seated, her hands once more folded serenely in her lap. Only when the door had closed did she allow herself a faint sigh. "So many sorrows come from pride," she said almost to herself. "It so often proves deadlier than outright malice." Threads of forgiveness. The summer sun was softening into a honey-colored dusk when Miss Marple finally found herself alone in her little parlor. The tumult of the afternoon had subsided. Inspector Trevelyan had departed with Ridley in his custody. Mr. Fallow and Mrs. Charteris had left pale and shaken, and the vicar and his wife had offered hushed words of gratitude. Before slipping away to their evening service, Miss Marple sat by the window with her needlework in her lap, though for some time she did not stitch. Instead, she watched the swallows dipping and soaring across the village rooftops, their tiny bodies black against the mellow sky. A sense of weariness settled upon her, not the weariness of the body, but of the heart. For all her small triumph in seeing justice done, she could not help grieving that human folly and resentment had so swiftly turned to tragedy. A quiet visitor, her reverie was interrupted by a gentle tap at the door. Mary peeked in with a questioning look. "Miss Marple, there's someone to see you. Miss Hannah Fallow." "Show her in, please, Mary." Hannah stepped into the room looking very unlike the bright girl who used to laugh at the village fetes. Her face was strained, eyes red-rimmed. She curtsied a little awkwardly. "I hope it's not too late to call." "Of course not, my dear. Do sit down. I was just admiring the evening light." Miss Marple's calmness seemed to steady the girl. She perched on the edge of the chair and twisted her gloves in her hands. "I came to thank you. Not for exposing Mr. Ridley, but for making certain the truth came out. Uncle has been so frightened these last weeks. Not because he was guilty, only because he worried the village would think so. What with that money Mr. Denning promised to my cousins. It's been dreadful for us. Double quotes. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. People often suffer most from fears that never quite materialize until suspicion makes them real. It is a harsh lesson for any village. Hannah gave a faint, tearful smile. It may take some time, but I hope Marleycombe can forgive itself for this. We've all whispered too freely. An unexpected reconciliation a moment later. There was another knock. To both women's surprise, Mrs. Charteris appeared in the doorway, her face equally drawn. She paused upon seeing Hannah, color rising in her cheeks. "Oh, I did not mean to intrude." Miss Marple rose, beckoning her in with a warm gesture. "Come in, dear Mrs. Charteris. I believe this meeting might do you both some good." There was a small, tense silence. Then Mrs. Charteris sighed. "I owe you an apology, Miss Fallow. I repeated things about your uncle I had no right to. Petty gossip, all because I feared someone might bring up my own foolish mistakes from long ago. I let my pride twist me." Hannah blinked rapidly. Then she reached out her gloved hand, hesitating before touching Mrs. Charteris's. "Thank you. That means a great deal. Perhaps we all ought to start anew." Miss Marple's gentle eyes glistened with quiet pride. How very wise. Forgiveness is seldom easy, but without it, small communities such as ours would crumble under their own bitterness. The inspector's final courtesy, not long after the ladies departed together, arm in arm, speaking in low, cautious tones that hinted at tentative new friendship. "Inspector." Trevelyan returned for a last word. He stood in the hall with his hat in hand, looking more respectful than Miss Marple had ever seen him. "I wish to say, Miss Marple, that while I might have found the evidence eventually, your careful observations spared us all much additional harm. You understood Ridley's temper far better than our reports ever could." Miss Marple gave a modest little laugh. "Oh, I do not flatter myself that I possess any brilliance, Inspector. I simply pay attention. A lifetime of church bazaars and parish picnics teaches one more about human nature than might be comfortable to admit. Well, your village is safer for it. Good evening, madam. Good evening, Inspector, and thank you." Peace returns to Marleycombe. The door closed. Behind him, Miss Marple moved to her writing desk by the window. She took out a piece of soft blue notepaper and began to compose a letter to her nephew Raymond, who would, no doubt, be simultaneously horrified and delighted at the dramatic events in her quiet village. Outside, lanterns were being lit in cottage windows. Children called to one another across the green. The toll of the church bell floated through the air, not ominous now, but merely marking time, as it always had. Miss Marple paused, pen in hand, reflecting on how quickly Marleycombe was learning to smile again. Tomorrow there would be gossip still, of course. Speculation and small scandals were as much a part of village life as rose hedges and jam contests. But beneath it all would run a steadier current of humility, perhaps even of grace. And in her soft armchair by the fire, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty that life here would mend. People would remember, at least for a little while, how fragile reputations were, how quick tempers could ruin lives, and how compassion might yet weave them back together. Whispers of new beginnings. A week had passed since Ridley's arrest, and Marleycombe was slowly settling back into its old rhythms. The market stalls on Thursday bustled once more with cheerful bargaining over gooseberries and fresh cheese, while children ran laughing through the lanes with scarcely a care. It was astonishing, Miss Marple thought as she walked to the grocer's, how quickly even the deepest wounds began to scab over when life insisted on continuing. The human heart, or perhaps simply human habit, could not help seeking comfort in the ordinary. A visit to the shops. Miss Marple stopped at Bexley's General Store to buy tea and a small jar of marmalade. Inside, she found Mrs. Bexley engaged in hushed conversation with Mrs. Twyford over the counter. Both ladies greeted her a little self-consciously. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Twyford, smoothing her apron. "I was just telling Mrs. Bexley here How thankful I am to see things returning to normal. Indeed, my dear. Though I think it does us all good to remember how fragile normal can be." Mrs. Bexley nodded soberly. Then she brightened. "But I've some happier news, too. Young Samuel Peters, you know, from the Carpenters, is finally engaged to Nancy Perks. After all the unpleasantness, it's grand to see someone planning for joy." "How delightful!" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "I do love a wedding. It puts the right sort of hope into the air, don't you find?" A small domestic mystery leaving the shop, Miss Marple found herself unexpectedly waylaid by little Tom Godfrey, the blacksmith's boy, who was trotting by with his dog. "Miss Marple," he cried breathlessly, "did you hear? Someone's been pinching gooseberries from the vicar's garden." "The vicar's wife is fit to burst," Miss Marple chuckled. "Oh dear, what a calamity. Perhaps the culprit has a fondness for tarts." Tom grinned, showing a missing tooth. "Ma says it's probably Mrs. Harper's hens again. They're sly as anything. Well, I dare say Marleycombe can survive a few missing gooseberries. Tell your mother I shall expect a report on whether the hens are found guilty." As the boy dashed off, Miss Marple smiled to herself. Even petty scandals seemed to carry a lighter weight now. Perhaps it was that after true tragedy, the village was learning not to inflate small troubles into monstrous fears. Hannah and her uncle later that afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the Fallows cottage under the pretense of returning a borrowed gardening book. She found Hannah trimming roses by the gate, her bonnet pushed back and a flush of real contentment on her cheeks. "How is your uncle today?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Oh, much improved. He's been out walking each morning, and seems determined to prove to the village he has nothing to hide. I think the kindness of some neighbors has helped enormously." Miss Marple laid a hand on the girl's arm. "That is very comforting to hear. It does take courage, after all, to remain where unpleasant suspicions once circled." Hannah smiled, a touch shyly. "He's had a kind letter even from Mrs. Charteris. It's as if everyone decided at once to try being neighborly again, which is often the best kind of justice, to let wounds close without more tearing." Reflections by twilight that evening. Miss Marple sat by her parlor window once more, watching the sun slip behind the thatched roofs. Somewhere down the lane, someone was playing a violin, a wistful tune that drifted over the hedges and into her open window. She thought of all the little stories twined through Marleycombe like ivy. Hannah's quiet relief, Samuel and Nancy's engagement, the mystery of the gooseberry thief. Life did not stop for one man's envy or anger. It picked itself up and continued, each person making small repairs where they could. Miss Marple folded her hands over her lap, her eyes thoughtful. She could not prevent the darkness in human nature from surfacing now and then, but she could take comfort in knowing that most hearts, given time and gentle encouragement, chose kindness over cruelty. And with that soft assurance, she settled back into her chair, ready to take up her knitting, for the village, after all, would always supply fresh tangles to unravel, even if not all were crimes worthy of the police. The case of the missing brooch. The next morning dawned bright and golden, with a faint promise of rain on the horizon that made every leaf glisten. Miss Marple took her breakfast by the window, amused to watch Mr. Ellis next door trying to patch a hole in his garden fence, while his chickens regarded him with deep suspicion. She had just settled in with her embroidery when there came a sharp rap at the door. On opening it, she found Mrs. Carter, flushed and breathless, clutching her handbag, as though it might fly away at any moment. A small domestic panic. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know where else to turn." Mrs. Carter burst out, hardly waiting for an invitation to come inside. "It's my grandmother's brooch, the amethyst one set with tiny seed pearls. It's gone." Miss Marple led her to a chair. poured a small glass of sherry, despite the hour, and patted her hand. "Now, dear, start at the beginning. When did you last see it?" "Yesterday afternoon. I put it out on my dressing table to pin to my shawl for the WIT. Then I went downstairs for just a moment, truly. Just a moment, and when I returned, it was gone." Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. "And has anyone been in the house? Tradesman? Or perhaps a neighbor dropping by?" "Only young Daisy Pritchard, helping with the linens." "Oh, Miss Marple, surely Daisy wouldn't. She's such a sweet child." "People are seldom as simple as they appear, my dear," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes twinkling. "But they're also not usually so wicked. We mustn't leap to conclusions." Investigations over T.B. that afternoon, Miss Marple had taken it upon herself to call at the Pritchards' cottage under the friendly excuse of delivering cuttings from her geraniums. Daisy greeted her with wide eyes, flushing to her freckled hairline. "Oh, yes, Mrs. Carter's brooch," Daisy stammered when Miss Marple brought it up lightly over tea. "She told Ma about it this morning, but I never saw it. Truly, Miss Marple, I was only there to fold napkins." Miss Marple nodded, sipping. Her gaze drifted around the modest sitting room, her sharp eyes noting a small sewing basket by the fireplace. "You've taken up your embroidery again, Daisy? That's such a sensible pastime." Daisy smiled, a little wobbly. "Ma's teaching me new stitches. She says idle hands are the devil's workshop. A very old proverb, and often true." The harmless truth later that evening, Miss Marple stopped by Mrs. Carter's with a calm smile. "My dear, I believe your brooch is quite safe. Have you by any chance looked inside the hem of your shawl?" Mrs. Carter blinked, astonished. "My shawl? Whatever for?" "I suspect you were interrupted while pinning it and tucked the brooch into the fold to keep it from falling. It happens rather often, a small absent-minded motion, forgotten at once." Sure enough, after a brief flurry of searching, Mrs. Carter gave a gasp of triumph. The amethyst brooch lay snug in a tiny crease of fabric. "Oh, Miss Marple, how can I ever thank you? I should have torn the house apart for nothing." Miss Marple merely laughed, patting her arm. "No thanks needed. I only use the same sort of common sense that tells me where my spectacles are hiding, usually on my own head." Restoring calm and curiosity as she walked home beneath the evening sky, Miss Marple found herself almost absurdly cheerful. It was a trifling puzzle, to be sure, but even trifles revealed much about human nature, about panic, guilt, small embarrassments, and the relief of being gently guided back to sense. She wondered idly whether, when she was gone, Marleycombe would still find its small mysteries to fret over. Undoubtedly it would, for life, she thought, was made up of countless lost brooches, whispered suspicions, tender hopes and foolish fears, and how very fortunate that was. For otherwise, how dull the village would be, and how little opportunity for kindly meddling on behalf of one's neighbors. With that thought warming her, Miss Marple turned up her lamp, settled into her chair, and picked up her knitting once more, ready, always, to be disturbed by the next gentle scandal that might wander up her garden path. A village fêted was the sort of warm, sun-soaked afternoon that seemed almost a reward for enduring England's uncertain summer. Down by the vicarage lawns, the annual Marleycombe fête was in full swing. Striped tents and bright bunting fluttered under a light breeze, while tables groaned under the weight of sponge cakes, scones, and cucumber sandwiches. Children darted about in shrieking delight, faces sticky with strawberry jam. Elderly gentlemen arranged themselves near the ale barrel, content to swap stories in comfortable shade. Everywhere Miss Marple looked, she saw laughter, flushed cheeks, and hands linked with shy affection. Hannah, and a quiet triumph near the tea urn. Hannah stood with her uncle, Mr. Follow, both more relaxed than they had been in months. Hannah's Simple blue frock and happy smile were quite transformed from the tense, anxious girl of weeks past. Several neighbors made a point of stopping to greet Mr. Fallow warmly. A small, tacit apology for their earlier suspicions, Miss Marple took. A delicate slice of seed cake from Mrs. Bexley, then joined Hannah by the table. "You're looking very well, my dear," she said, genuinely pleased. "It feels like we can finally breathe again," Hannah admitted. Her hand tightened slightly on her uncle's arm. "Uncle has decided to stay on here. He says he won't be chased out by idle gossip, and he's even taken on a little bookkeeping work for the Charterizes. How splendid! Marleycombe is the better for his staying, though it may not realize just how fortunate it is. New courtships blossom elsewhere." Samuel Peters and Nancy Perks were nearly inseparable, whispering together near the hoopla stall. From the fond, exasperated glance Mrs. Perks shot them, it was clear their upcoming marriage was now the chief topic of speculation in Marleycombe. Miss Marple overheard snatches of delighted planning. Which cousins might be invited, what the wedding breakfast should include, and whether Mr. Kettering's niece could be prevailed upon to play the organ. "It's good to see love returning," Mrs. Twyford remarked, settling next to Miss Marple on a wooden bench. "We all needed something light to think on after—" "Well, yes, indeed." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Life insists on going forward. If it didn't, I suppose we should all crumble into dust." A whisper of remaining mysteries. As afternoon faded toward dusk, the fate wound down. Bunting was carefully folded, leftover sponge cake wrapped for charity, and young men laughingly carried heavy tables back to the church hall. Miss Marple lingered near the rose arch, enjoying the hush that had fallen. A pair of robins chirped in the hedges, unconcerned with human joys or tragedies. And still, Marleycombe's currents continued beneath the tranquil surface. Miss Marple had noticed, for instance, how Mrs. Carter seemed quite animated in conversation with Mr. Ellis, the widower, her hand resting on his sleeve just a touch longer than strictly necessary. How curious! Or how Daisy Pritchard's bright giggle, so recently troubled, was now freely given to the local post boy. No crime in it, merely the soft reshuffling of hearts, which Miss Marple suspected would occupy the village long after. Police files on Ridley's guilt were gathering dust. The vicar's quiet gratitude as she prepared to depart. The vicar approached her with a humble smile. "Miss Marple, I do not think I ever properly thanked you, not only for guiding the police, but for guiding us. Your example of patience and charity was more of a sermon than I could ever preach." Miss Marple colored slightly. "Nonsense. Dear vicar, I am only an old woman with far too much time to observe her neighbors." "Even so," he said gently, "you have given Marleycombe back to itself." She inclined her head, touched, and as she walked home beneath lanterns being slowly extinguished, she thought it was perhaps the best benediction one could hope for, that a village torn by suspicion could be stitched together again by small acts of kindness, a quiet word here, a tactful silence there. Tea at Sunset Miss Marple's parlor was bathed in the tender light of evening. Outside her window, the village of Marleycombe seemed almost to drowse under a canopy of drifting swallows and faint chiming bells from the church tower. Inside, small fire glowed against the lingering cool of summer dusk. Miss Marple sat opposite her dear friend, Mrs. Bexley, the two women with their heads bent together over a well-polished tea service and a plate of walnut biscuits. "I can hardly believe it's all over," Mrs. Bexley said at last, shaking her head. "Why, it seems only yesterday we were whispering about the murder as if scandal itself might come knocking at our doors. And now we whisper about who might next be married, or whether the vicar's sister has been dyeing her hair." Miss Marple said, her blue eyes sparkling with amusement. They shared a gentle laugh. It felt good, almost restorative, to let the burden of dark speculations slip away into harmless village tattle. Looking backward, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting needles resting quietly in her lap. "You know, Bexley, I've thought a great deal about this whole business. It's rather dreadful how close we came to allowing fear to divide us completely." "Oh, indeed." "Why, I caught myself crossing the street to avoid poor Mr. Fallow. I'm ashamed to admit it." "We are none of us immune," Miss Marple said gently. "I've lived long enough to see how quickly people seize upon a likely culprit, how easily their own grievances or petty jealousies slip into something like certainty. A harmless old quarrel becomes a reason to suspect murder." Mrs. Bexley nodded, swallowing hard. "That's why I'm grateful it was you who noticed what others did not." Miss Marple waved a hand modestly. "My dear, it was simply a matter of small observations, things other people overlooked because they were too busy being certain. Human nature tells more than footprints ever can." A final reflection on human hearts, the fire settled with a soft sigh. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, working a careful row in pale blue wool. For a few moments they sat in a companionable hush, broken only by the ticking of the old mantel clock and the distant bark of a dog. At last she spoke, almost to herself. "People think wickedness is grand and dramatic, a scoundrel in a cloak, with a dagger, but more often it's something quite plain. A fear of losing face, a silly desire for money, a bitterness that grows unnoticed. And goodness?" Mrs. Bexley asked, her voice very low. Miss Marple smiled. "Goodness is usually quiet, too. It's staying your tongue when you long to gossip, or bringing a cake to someone you once disliked, or seeing the truth of a person instead of the tailies about them." Mrs. Bexley reached across to squeeze her hand. "Then Marleycombe is fortunate to have you to remind us." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Marleycombe will do very well, with or without me. Villages always heal themselves in time. New scandals come, new babies are born, old feuds burn out. Life is rather clever that way." The lamp is lit outside. The first street lamps bloomed like tiny golden flowers along the lane. Mrs. Bexley rose to take her leave, promising to send along her recipe for seed cake. Miss Marple walked her to the door, stood on the step a moment, to watch her friend vanish into the dusk, and went back inside. She paused by the mantel, adjusting a small vase of sweet peas. Her house was very still, yet it did not feel lonely. It seemed rather to hold its breath, as if even the walls listened for the next footstep on the path, the next knock that might bring a mystery, or simply another dear friend in need of tea and comfort. Miss Marple lit her lamp, drew her knitting close, and settled in. Whatever came tomorrow, scandal, sorrow, or joy, she would be ready to see it truly, and judge it gently. Because after all, in her quiet way, that had always been her life's greatest delight.